Fire doesn't ask permission. It doesn't care if you're ready. And on that scorching August night in 1884, when lightning split the Wyoming sky and turned 10,000 acres into a death trap, Ella Hartley learned that survival isn't about being strong, it's about being found. What she didn't know was that the man thundering through those flames on a black stallion owned half the state, had buried his heart 6 feet deep, and was about to risk everything for a woman and child he'd never met. This is their story. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The heat arrived first. Not the fire itself, but the promise of it. A suffocating blanket of scorched air that pressed against Ella Hartley's cabin windows like an unwanted visitor demanding entry. She'd been standing at the wash basin, humming softly while Jonah nursed at her breast, when the temperature in the room climbed 10 degrees in as many seconds. The hum died in her throat. Through the window, the western horizon had turned the color of rust and blood. Ella's hands, still damp from the wash water, began to tremble. She'd lived in Wyoming territory for 3 years, long enough to know that color, long enough to understand what it meant when the birds went silent and the deer came streaming past your property like refugees fleeing an invisible army. Fire. The word stuck in her throat like a bone. She pulled Jonah closer, his small fingers curling instinctively against her collarbone, and moved to the door. The moment she opened it, the smell hit her. Pine sap burning, sage turning to ash, the acrid bite of earth itself being consumed. Smoke rolled across the valley floor in gray waves, obscuring the creek bed she'd walked just that morning. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." But nature doesn't negotiate. The cabin, if you could call it that, was little more than 4 walls and a prayer. Ella's husband Thomas had built it with promises of expansion, of glass windows and a real floor, of neighbors and community. Then Thomas had put a bullet in his head one frozen February morning, leaving her with an infant, $40, and a structure that leaked when it rained and groaned when the wind blew. She'd stayed because she had nowhere else to go, because pride tastes better than pity, because admitting failure felt worse than dying alone. Now dying alone had become a very real possibility. Ella's mind raced through her options with the desperate efficiency of a cornered animal. The nearest town was Redemption Creek, 15 miles east, impossible to reach on foot with a 6-month-old baby. The Mortensen place sat 8 miles north, but Clay Mortensen had made his intentions clear the last time he'd visited, his eyes lingering on her body while his words dripped with false concern. She'd rather burn. The McGovern Ranch lay 6 miles south, but that meant crossing directly through the valley, straight into the fire's path. That left west, into the mountains, toward higher ground in the thin hope that elevation might spare her what flatland couldn't. Ella moved with mechanical precision, her fear compressed into action. She grabbed Thomas's wool coat from the peg, too large, too heavy, but it might protect Jonah from sparks. She filled her canteen from the bucket, stuffed 2 biscuits into her pocket, and wrapped Jonah in a cotton blanket that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman Ella had never met, but whose stitching might now save her grandson's life. She didn't take the photograph of her wedding day, didn't take the letters from her sister in Philadelphia, didn't take the Bible with her mother's maiden name inscribed inside the cover. Some things you save, some things you let burn. She kicked dirt over the stove fire, a laughable gesture given what approached, and stepped into the gathering dusk. The sun had disappeared behind a wall of smoke that rose thousands of feet into the atmosphere, turning afternoon into apocalypse. Ash fell like snow. In the distance, she could hear it now, a sound like rushing water, like a train that never stopped, like the earth breathing out everything it had held in. The fire was singing, and it was getting closer. Ella ran. Her bare feet, she'd forgotten shoes, forgotten everything except the weight of Jonah against her chest, pounded against hard-packed dirt that still held the day's heat. Thomas's coat flapped around her like broken wings. She clutched Jonah so tightly he began to whimper, and she forced herself to loosen her grip even as every instinct screamed to hold tighter, tighter, never let go. "Shh, baby," she gasped, though her voice came out strangled. "Shh, we're okay. We're okay, we're—" A pine tree 50 yards to her left exploded. That's what it looked like. Not catching fire, but detonating. The sap inside superheating until the trunk split down the middle and sent burning shrapnel spinning through the air. Ella screamed and dove sideways, curling around Jonah as embers landed in her hair, against her back, on the coat that now justified its cumbersome weight. She beat at her head with one hand while keeping the other locked around her son. The smell of burning hair joined the symphony of destruction around her. Jonah was crying now, full-throated wails that might have broken her heart if terror hadn't gotten there first. I know, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. She scrambled to her feet and kept running, but the landscape had transformed. What had been familiar terrain, the path she'd walked 100 times to check the creek, the outcropping where she sometimes sat to watch the sunset, had become an alien world painted in orange and black. Smoke obscured everything beyond 20 feet. Her eyes streamed tears that evaporated on her cheeks. Each breath felt like swallowing glass. The fire had surrounded her. Not completely, not yet, but she could see it now, racing through the valley on 3 sides. It moved like a living thing, leaping from tree to tree, crawling through the brush with terrifying intelligence. It found the driest timber and consumed it. It found the richest veins of sage and devoured them. It turned everything Ella had known into ash and absence. She changed direction, angling toward a gap in the flames, a corridor of unburned ground that seemed to lead up slope. Her lungs burned. Her feet, already cut and bleeding from unseen rocks, left dark prints on the pale dirt. Jonah had stopped crying, which was somehow worse than the wailing. His small body had gone frighteningly still against her chest. "Stay with me," she chanted. "Stay with me, baby. Stay with me." The gap was closing. Ella could see it happening in real time, watching the fire advance from both sides like jaws preparing to snap shut. She had maybe 30 seconds to make it through, maybe less. She pushed her body beyond exhaustion, beyond reason, beyond anything she'd thought herself capable of. Her vision narrowed to tunnel focus. The world became distance and flame, and the diminishing space between them. 20 feet. 15. The heat grew so intense it felt liquid, like running through an oven filled with molten air. 10 feet. She could see through to the other side. Darker sky, less smoke. Safety was a sprint away. 5 feet. A dead pine, already burning at its base, chose that moment to fall. Ella saw it happening with dreamlike clarity. The trunk beginning to tilt, the burning crown swinging through space in a graceful arc that ended exactly where she needed to be. She tried to stop, to change direction, but momentum carried her forward. The tree fell across the gap with a sound like God's fist slamming a door. The corridor was gone. Ella stood frozen, Jonah pressed against her heart, surrounded by walls of flame on 4 sides. The smoke had thickened to the point where she couldn't see the sky. Couldn't see anything except fire and the small circle of ground beneath her feet. A patch of dirt maybe 10 feet across. An island in an ocean of destruction. This was where they would die. The knowledge arrived with strange calm. She'd fought. She'd tried. Some battles aren't meant to be won by the people fighting them. Ella sank to her knees, then sat, arranging herself against the trunk of a thick-barked pine that hadn't yet caught fire, though it would, soon. Everything would. She unwrapped Jonah enough to see his face. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Maybe the smoke would take him gently before the flames arrived. Maybe he wouldn't suffer. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pressing her lips to his forehead. "I'm so sorry, my sweet boy. I wanted to give you everything. I wanted—" Her voice broke. There was so much she'd wanted. A life. A future. A world where her son grew up to be a man, where he fell in love and built things and laughed until his belly hurt. She'd wanted to see him take his first steps, hear his first words, watch him discover the fierce joy of being alive. Instead, she'd given him 6 months and a death sentence. "Your daddy loved you," she said, though she wasn't sure it was true. Thomas had been too broken to love anyone by the end. "And I loved you so much. So much, Jonah. You were everything good I ever made." The fire crept closer. Ella closed her eyes and began to sing. A lullaby her own mother had sung, back when the world was safe and death was something that happened to other people. Her voice cracked on the high notes. Smoke turned her words to rasps, but she sang anyway because what else was there to do? How else could a mother send her baby into darkness except with a song? "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." The heat intensified until her skin felt like it was splitting. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. She could hear the fire breathing, consuming, destroying everything it touched. And if that mockingbird don't sing, Jonah stirred against her chest. His small hand pressed against her collarbone, and she covered it with her own, one last touch, one last connection before they both turned to ash. Mama's gonna buy you a hooves. The sound punched through the fire's roar like a bullet through flesh, unmistakable, impossible, real. Ella's eyes snapped open. Through the smoke and shimmer of heat, she saw a shape materializing from the flames themselves. A horse, black as midnight, nostrils flaring, eyes rolling white with terror but still moving forward, still obeying the man on its back. And what a man! He sat the saddle like he'd been born there, like horse and rider were a single creature forged in some god's workshop. Tall, she could tell even mounted, with shoulders that blocked out the fire behind him. He wore a dark duster that sparked and smoldered in a dozen places. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face she couldn't see clearly, but she didn't need to see his face to understand what was happening. Someone had ridden into hell to find her. The horse pulled up short of the burning pine that blocked the gap. The rider, moving with economical grace, pulled a rope from his saddle and swung it twice overhead before sending it sailing toward a thick branch that jutted from a nearby tree. The loop caught. He pulled it taut, testing the hold, then turned in the saddle to look directly at Ella. "Can you stand?" His voice carried despite the fire's roar, deep, rough, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed because it had never learned to beg. Ella tried to answer, but no sound emerged. She nodded instead, shakily getting to her feet while keeping Jonah clutched against her. "Listen to me." He was already moving, pulling a second rope, this one with a broad loop at the end. "When I throw this, you're going to step into it and hold on. You understand? Don't drop the baby. Don't let go of the rope. Just hold on and trust the horse." Ella's voice cracked. "I can't." "You can." Not harsh, but absolute. "You're going to. 3 seconds. Ready?" He didn't wait for confirmation. The rope sailed through the air. Ella caught it clumsily, nearly dropping it before getting her foot through the loop. She pulled it up around her waist, shifting Jonah to free one hand while keeping the other locked around the rope. "Hold tight!" The rider spurred his horse forward. The rope snapped taut. Ella gasped as she was yanked off her feet and dragged across the ground. She tried to keep her body curved around Jonah, protecting him from the worst of it, but rocks and roots battered her back and legs. The burning pine they'd been trapped behind swept past in a blur of orange light. Then they were through the gap, impossibly, miraculously through, into clear air on the other side. The rider pulled his horse to a stop and was off the saddle before the animal had fully halted. He moved toward Ella with long strides, his duster falling open to reveal a simple work shirt, suspenders, and a gun belt that looked like it had seen considerable use. He knelt beside her, and Ella finally saw his face. Hard would be the first word. Weathered would be the second. He looked like he'd been carved from the same rock that made the mountains. All angles and severity, with a jaw that could break lesser men's fists and eyes the color of winter storms. A scar ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, pale against sun-darkened skin. He wasn't young, 40, maybe 45, but age sat on him like a weapon he'd learned to wield. The baby. His hands, scarred, capable, surprisingly gentle, reached for Jonah. "Let me see." Ella's arms tightened instinctively. Some part of her brain, still functioning despite the shock, whispered warnings about strange men and vulnerable children. But a larger part, the part that understood she had no options left, reluctantly loosened her grip. He took Jonah with the care of someone who'd held infants before, supporting the head with one large hand while checking him over with clinical efficiency. His fingers pressed lightly against Jonah's neck, feeling for a pulse. He brought his face close to the baby's mouth, checking breath. "He's all right," the man said, and the relief in his voice surprised her. "Smoke got him a little, but he's breathing steady. You did good, keeping him covered." "Is he—" Ella couldn't finish the question. Her body had begun to shake uncontrollably now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "He's alive. You both are. Now let's keep it that way." He stood, still holding Jonah, and looked at Ella with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't quite indifference either. Can you ride? I I don't know. Maybe. I've never. Then you're learning tonight. Come on. He reached down with his free hand. An offer, not a command. Ella stared at it for a moment. This stranger's hand was the difference between survival and death, and she knew nothing about him. Not his name, not his intentions, not whether saving her would come with a price she couldn't afford to pay. But Jonah was in his arms, and the fire was still advancing. And sometimes trust isn't a choice. It's just the only option that doesn't guarantee dying. She took his hand. He pulled her up with shocking ease, as if she weighed nothing at all. Up close, he smelled like smoke and horse and something else. Leather, maybe, or saddle soap. Something clean despite the destruction around them. Here! He handed Jonah back to her, then pulled a heavy wool blanket from his saddlebag. It was soaking wet. Wrap him in this. It'll protect him from sparks. Then wrap yourself. Ella obeyed with numb fingers. The wet wool was cold after the fire's heat, a shock that felt almost painful. She swaddled Jonah until only his face peeked out, then draped the remaining fabric over her own shoulders. The man mounted his horse in one smooth motion, then reached down for her. Give me your hand. When I pull, push off with your feet. I'll do the rest. She did. He did. And suddenly Ella found herself sitting sideways across the saddle. Jonah clutched against her chest, the stranger's arm locked around her waist like an iron bar. The horse danced nervously beneath them, wanting to run, held in check only by the rider's will. Hold on, he said simply. Then they were moving. Not a gallop, the terrain was too rough, the visibility too poor, but something faster than a trot, a controlled urgency that ate up ground without sacrificing safety. The horse moved like it knew every rock, every hole, every dangerous step. Maybe it did. This felt like land the animal had covered 1,000 times. Behind them, the fire raged on. Ella twisted to look back and immediately wished she hadn't. The valley had become a vision of damnation, flames reaching hundreds of feet into the sky, entire hillsides glowing like coals, the darkness above them illuminated by destruction below. Her cabin, if it still stood, would be gone within the hour. Everything she'd built, everything she'd endured, reduced to memory and ash. Don't look back, the man said quietly. Nothing there worth seeing now. He was right, but it hurt anyway. They rode in silence, the only sounds the horse's heavy breathing, the creak of leather, and the distant roar of fire slowly fading behind them. Ella's body had moved beyond pain into a strange numbness where nothing felt entirely real. She existed in a bubble of motion and shock, aware that something terrible had happened but unable to fully process it. The man's arm around her waist was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to smoke and confusion. After what might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours, time had lost all meaning. The landscape began to change. The air cleared, the ground leveled, and through the darkness ahead, Ella saw lights, not firelights, lamplights. The warm yellow glow of human habitation scattered across what appeared to be a massive compound. Buildings, plural, arranged with military precision, corrals filled with horses, barns that dwarfed her entire cabin. And at the center of it all, a house that could only be called a manor, 3 stories of timber and stone that spoke of wealth beyond anything Ella had imagined existed in Wyoming territory. "Where are we?" she whispered. "Carter Ranch." He said it like that should mean something. When she didn't respond, he added, "You're safe here, both of you." Carter. The name tickled something in her memory. Stories overheard in Redemption Creek, gossip traded at the general store. Carter Ranch. Carter Land. The Carter name spoken with a mixture of respect and fear, attached to a man who supposedly owned half the territory and answered to no one. She turned her head to look at the stranger who'd saved her life. "You're Rowan Carter." It wasn't a question, she knew. The way people had talked about him, like he was more legend than man, more force of nature than human being, suddenly made sense. Of course he'd ridden into fire. Men like him didn't die in fires. They bent fire to their will. "I am," he confirmed, his voice giving nothing away. They crossed through a gate, elaborate ironwork bearing the letter C, and into the compound proper. Men emerged from the buildings, rushing forward with worry carved into their faces. "Boss!" One of them, grizzled, bow-legged, clearly the foreman, grabbed the horse's bridle. Jesus Christ, we thought you were dead. The fire. I'm fine. Rowan dismounted with that same fluid grace, then reached up for Ella. She's not. Get Doc Morrison. Now. Boss, Doc's in town dealing with... Then get him out of town. Rowan's voice didn't rise, but something in it made the foreman step back. This woman and her child just survived a wildfire. I want a doctor checking them within the hour. Make it happen. Yes, sir. The foreman took off at a run. Rowan lifted Ella down as carefully as he'd pulled her up. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched ground. He caught her, shifting his grip to support her weight while keeping Jonah safe between them. Easy, he murmured. I've got you. I can walk, Ella protested weakly. Maybe, but you don't have to. He was already moving toward the house, carrying her like she weighed no more than the child in her arms. Save your strength for healing. The world tilted and swayed. Ella's vision began to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. She fought it, but exhaustion and shock formed an alliance she couldn't defeat. Jonah, she managed to whisper, please don't. I won't. Rowan's voice followed her down into the darkness. I promise. You're both safe now. Ella wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that promises from strangers could be kept, that safety was something that existed beyond this moment. But trust was a luxury she'd lost long ago, buried in the same grave as her husband's broken dreams. Still, as consciousness slipped away, she found herself hoping, just a little, just enough, that maybe this time the promises would hold. Maybe this time she wouldn't wake up alone. Consciousness returned in fragments, the smell of lavender soap, the weight of clean sheets, the distant sound of men's voices drifting through an open window. Ella's eyes opened to unfamiliar ceiling beams, dark timber crossed with expert joinery that spoke of craftsmen who took pride in their work. Morning light filtered through lace curtains she definitely hadn't owned yesterday. Yesterday. The memories crashed back with physical force. Fire, running, Jonah's terrified crying, the stranger on the black horse who'd pulled them from certain death. Jonah. Ella bolted upright, ignoring the screaming protest from every muscle in her body. Her hands went to her chest, searching for the weight that should have been there. Empty. Her son was gone. No, she gasped, throwing back the covers. She was wearing a nightgown, soft cotton, definitely not hers, and her feet were wrapped in clean bandages. None of that mattered. Jonah! The door opened before she could reach it. A woman entered, older, 50-ish, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that assessed Ella with the efficiency of a battlefield surgeon. Back in bed, the woman said firmly. Right now, before you tear those stitches. My son, where is my son? Safe, fed, sleeping in the next room, has been for the past 6 hours. The woman moved forward, her hands gentle despite her commanding tone, guiding Ella back toward the bed. The boss has been checking on him every hour. Child's fine. Better than you, truth be told. Ella resisted, her body trembling with adrenaline and fear. I need to see him. I need to, and you will, after you sit down and let me check your vitals. The woman's expression softened slightly. I'm Martha Hayes. I run this house, have for 20 years. Your boy is safe here. Safer than he'd be anywhere else in the territory. Now sit. Something in Martha's voice, not unkind but utterly uncompromising, made Ella obey. She sank back onto the bed, her hands clenched in the unfamiliar nightgown. That's better. Martha pulled a chair closer and sat, her gaze traveling over Ella with professional assessment. Dr. Morrison came last night, said you had some burns, minor, thank God, and your feet were torn up pretty bad. He stitched the worst of it, left instructions for care. Said you and the baby were lucky to be alive. I want to see Jonah, Ella repeated, her voice breaking. Please. Martha studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but you're not walking on those feet. Stay put. She rose and disappeared through a connecting door Ella hadn't noticed before. When she returned, she was carrying a bundle wrapped in a clean blanket, a bundle that stirred and made a small, sleepy sound that shot straight through Ella's heart. Here, Martha placed Jonah in Ella's arms with practiced ease. Healthy as a horse. Barely even coughed this morning. Ella pulled her son close, breathing in his scent, milk and soap and something ineffably him. Her hands ran over his body with desperate thoroughness, checking for injuries, for burns, for any sign that the fire had marked him. But Martha was right. Apart from some redness around his nose from the smoke, Jonah appeared unharmed. He blinked up at her with those serious gray eyes, then yawned widely enough to show his toothless gums. The sob that escaped Ella's throat was half laugh, half prayer. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to Martha, to God, or to the stranger who'd ridden through hell to save them. "Thank you." Martha's expression gentled further. "You're a mother. You'd have done the same." She moved toward the door, then paused. "The boss will want to know you're awake. He's been concerned." "Rowan Carter." "That's right." Something flickered across Martha's face, an emotion Ella couldn't quite read. "He brought you in last night looking like he'd ridden through damnation itself. Wouldn't let anyone else tend to you until the doctor arrived. Stood right outside this door for 2 hours, waiting." Ella didn't know what to say to that. Men didn't wait outside doors for strange women they'd rescued. Men collected their debts and moved on. Why? The question emerged before she could stop it. Martha's smile was sad and knowing. "That's a question you'll have to ask him yourself. I'll send up breakfast. You need to eat, both for yourself and for that baby you're nursing." She left before Ella could respond, pulling the door closed with a soft click. Alone with Jonah, Ella allowed herself to simply hold him, to rock slowly back and forth while tears she hadn't known she was holding finally spilled over. They'd survived. Against impossible odds, against fire and fate, and every cruel thing the universe could throw at them, they'd survived, because a stranger had decided they were worth saving. The next 3 days passed in a blur of careful healing and growing confusion. Martha appeared like clockwork, bringing meals that were far too elaborate for someone who'd arrived with nothing, checking Ella's bandages, taking Jonah for short periods so Ella could sleep without worry. Dr. Morrison visited twice more, pronouncing himself satisfied with her progress and mystified by her luck. "I've seen men with less smoke exposure than you die within hours," he said, peering at her through spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. "You shouldn't be breathing this easy." "The blanket," Ella said quietly. "He gave us a wet blanket." Morrison nodded slowly. "Smart. The water would have filtered the worst of the smoke, kept the heat from your lungs." He began repacking his medical bag. "You owe that man your life. Both your lives." Ella knew. God, did she know. The debt sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and impossible to dislodge. She'd been raised to pay her debts, to never accept charity she couldn't repay. But how did you repay someone for pulling you from fire? How did you put a price on your child's breath? But Rowan Carter himself remained conspicuously absent. Ella heard him, his voice carrying from somewhere downstairs, giving orders, discussing feed prices and fence repairs with his men. Once, she saw him from her window, crossing the yard with that same economical stride, his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. But he never came to her room, never asked to see how she was healing, never sought payment for the rescue or gratitude for the shelter. It was Martha who finally explained on the 4th morning while helping Ella take her first careful steps across the room. "The boss doesn't know how to talk to women," Martha said bluntly. "Not anymore. Hasn't had a woman under this roof, aside from me, in near 6 years. Ella's feet throbbed with each step, but she forced herself to keep moving. Weakness was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Why not?" "That's his story to tell, not mine." Martha steadied her at the window, where Ella could look out over the compound. In daylight, it was even more impressive. Acres of corrals, multiple barns, bunkhouses that could sleep dozens of men. This wasn't just a ranch. It was an empire. "But I'll tell you this much. Rowan Carter is the best man I've ever known, and the loneliest. Those two things aren't unrelated." Before Ella could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Martha called out permission to enter, and a young man stepped inside, barely 20, with sandy hair and an eager expression that reminded Ella of a friendly dog. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said, addressing Ella with exaggerated formality. "But the boss asked me to bring you this." He held out a small wooden object carefully wrapped in cloth. Ella took it, confused. When she pulled back the fabric, her breath caught. It was a horse. A tiny, perfect horse carved from pale pine, every detail rendered with meticulous care. The arch of the neck, the flare of the nostrils, even the individual strands of the mane. The wood had been sanded until it felt like silk under her fingers. "He made it," the young man said proudly. "Been working on it every night since you arrived. Said every baby should have a toy." Ella stared at the carving, something hot and complicated rising in her throat. This was the work of hours, of patience, of hands that knew how to create as well as destroy. She thought of those hands pulling her from the fire, wrapping her in wet wool, carrying her to safety. "Thank him for me," she managed to say. "Please." The young man nodded and left. Ella turned the horse over in her hands, tracing the smooth lines with one finger. Beside her crib, Jonah had woken and was watching her with those serious eyes. "Look," she whispered, showing him the carving. "Someone made this for you. Someone who—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence. Someone who cared. Someone who thought you mattered. Someone who'd ridden into fire because your life had value. That night, Ella made a decision. She waited until the house had settled into evening quiet, until the sounds of men returning to the bunkhouse had faded, and the lamps in the windows had begun to wink out one by one. Then, moving carefully on her heeling feet, she made her way downstairs. Martha had shown her the layout of the house during one of her visits. Kitchen to the left, sitting room to the right, Rowan's study at the end of the hall. The study door was closed, but light showed beneath it. Ella raised her hand to knock, hesitated, then forced herself to follow through. 3 sharp raps that sounded too loud in the quiet house. "Come." She opened the door to find Rowan Carter sitting behind a massive oak desk, papers spread before him, an oil lamp casting harsh shadows across his already severe features. He looked up at her entrance, and for just a moment something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or concern, before his expression settled back into careful neutrality. "Mrs. Hartley." He stood, a gesture of respect that felt oddly formal given that he'd carried her unconscious body through his house 4 days ago. "You shouldn't be walking yet." "I needed to thank you." Ella remained in the doorway, suddenly unsure. This man had saved her life, but she didn't know him. Didn't know if gratitude would be welcome or embarrassing. "For everything. The rescue, the doctor, the room, She held up the carved horse. "This." Rowan's gaze dropped to the carving, and something in his expression shifted. "It's nothing, just wood." "It's not nothing." Ella stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Propriety be damned, she owed this man honesty at the very least. "Mr. Carter, I have no money. No way to pay you back for what you've done. I lost everything in that fire. My home, my belongings, what little I had. So I can't repay you. But I want you to know—" Her voice cracked. "I want you to know that what you did, riding into that fire, saving us, it mattered. We matter. Because of you." Rowan stood very still, his hands braced on the desk, his eyes fixed on her face with uncomfortable intensity. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "You don't owe me anything." "I owe you everything." "No." He moved around the desk, and Ella forced herself not to step back even though every instinct screamed wariness. But he stopped a careful distance away, giving her space. "You survived because you fought. You kept that baby alive through smoke and fire because you refused to give up. I just provided transportation." The corner of Ella's mouth twitched despite everything. Very expensive transportation. Something that might have been a smile ghosted across Rowan's face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. "The horse doesn't mind." Silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. Ella studied the man who'd saved her life, really looking at him for the first time without fear or shock coloring her vision. The scar on his face was old, the kind that came from a knife, not an accident. His hands bore their own map of violence, knuckles that had been broken and healed wrong, scars across the palms that spoke of rope burns and barbed wire. This was a man who'd fought for everything he had. "Martha says you've been checking on Jonah," Ella said quietly. Rowan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. making sure he was breathing properly. Smoke can do damage you don't see right away. Every hour, she said. I couldn't sleep anyway. Why? The question emerged softer than she'd intended, more vulnerable. Why do you care? You don't know us. For a long moment, Rowan didn't answer. He turned away from her, moving to the window that looked out over his empire. When he spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. I had a son once. Not by blood, but by choice. A boy who worked here on the ranch, maybe 14, 15 years old. Smart kid, quick with horses. Had a laugh that could make even the hardest men smile. He paused, his shoulders rigid. There was a fire. 3 years ago. Lightning strike, same as what got your place. The boy was in the south pasture, checking fences. By the time we realized how fast it was moving, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. I'm sorry, Ella whispered. I rode out looking for him, searched for 2 days, found his body near Copper Creek. He'd tried to outrun it. Rowan's reflection in the window was carved from stone. I've replayed that day 1,000 times. If I'd been faster, if I'd realized sooner, if I'd just been paying attention instead of focused on paperwork and profits, it wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? He turned back to her, and the pain in his eyes was raw enough to hurt. I owned the land. I employed the boy. I sent him out there alone. Whose fault was it, if not mine? Ella understood then. The hours spent checking on Jonah, the carved horse, the careful distance he maintained. This wasn't charity. This was penance. Mr. Carter. Rowan. Just Rowan. Rowan. The name felt strange on her tongue, too intimate for a man she barely knew. Saving us doesn't bring him back. I know. His voice was flat, empty. But it doesn't hurt either. What could she say to that? What words could possibly address the kind of guilt that made a man ride into fire chasing ghosts? Ella stood in the lamplight of his study, holding a carved horse and a debt she could never repay, and felt the weight of both their losses settling between them like snow. I should let you rest, Rowan said finally, moving back toward his desk. The walls were going up again, the vulnerability locked away behind that severe expression. Martha will have my hide if she knows I kept you standing this long. Wait. Ella didn't know what made her speak. What desperate instinct pushed the words out? Let me work for you. Rowan froze. What? I need to pay you back. I need to... She gestured helplessly at the room, at the house, at everything his wealth represented and her poverty lacked. I can't take charity. I won't. So let me work. I can cook, clean, help Martha with the house. I'm strong, I'm willing, and I promise I won't... No. The word was absolute. Final. Ella felt something inside her chest crack. Please, I'm not asking for much, just a way to earn... I said no. Rowan's voice had gone cold, distant. You need to heal. The baby needs you. When you're ready, I'll have my men take you wherever you want to go. Redemption Creek, Cheyenne, wherever, with enough money to start over. But you're not working here. Shame burned through Ella's veins like acid. Of course. She'd been a fool to think he'd want her here, a charity case with nothing to offer. He'd done his good deed, eased his guilty conscience. Now he wanted her gone. I understand, she said stiffly. Thank you for your generosity. She turned toward the door, her healing feet suddenly throbbing with renewed pain. Behind her, Rowan spoke again, his voice different, strained. It's not that I don't think you're capable. Ella paused, but didn't turn around. It's that you've already lost too much. And this place, he let out a slow breath. This place has a way of taking things from people. I won't be responsible for taking anything more from you. Ella did turn then, confusion overriding hurt. What are you talking about? But Rowan had already sat back down, his attention fixed on the papers before him with deliberate intensity. Good night, Mrs. Hartley. Martha will bring you breakfast in the morning. It was a dismissal. Ella recognized it, even if she didn't understand it. She left the study, closing the door with careful softness, and made her way back upstairs. In her borrowed room, Jonah slept peacefully in his makeshift crib, one tiny fist curled beside his cheek. Ella set the carved horse on the windowsill where moonlight could find it, then climbed back into bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the conversation, trying to parse meaning from Rowan Carter's words. He'd saved them. He clearly cared, or cared enough to carve toys and check breathing every hour. But he also wanted them gone, because this place takes things from people. What did that mean? The answer came 3 mornings later, when Ella was strong enough to venture downstairs properly. She found Martha in the kitchen, up to her elbows in bread dough, and the older woman's face lit up at the sight of her. "Look at you walking without wincing. The boss will be pleased." "Will he?" Ella couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Martha's hands stilled in the dough. "He's been asking about you every morning, whether you slept, whether Jonah nursed well, whether the pain was manageable." She resumed kneading with renewed vigor. "That man cares, even if he doesn't know how to show it." "He wants me to leave." Ella said it flatly, testing the words. "He wants you safe." Martha shaped the dough into a smooth ball and set it aside to rise. "There's a difference. I don't understand him. Join the club." Martha wiped her hands on her apron and gestured toward the kitchen table. "Sit. I'll make tea and tell you what you need to know about Rowan Carter." Over strong tea and fresh bread with butter, Martha told the story. It came out in pieces, a narrative assembled from years of observation and a loyalty that ran bone deep. Rowan had come to Wyoming Territory 15 years ago, a veteran of range wars down in Texas with a reputation for being fast with a gun and faster with his fists. He'd won the original Carter land in a poker game, 3,000 acres that no one else wanted because the water rights were disputed and the terrain was too rough for cattle. Within 5 years, he'd cleared the water rights, doubled his acreage, and turned the worthless land into the most profitable ranch in the territory. "He worked like a man possessed," Martha said, her eyes distant with memory. 18-hour days, sleeping in the bunkhouse with his men, eating nothing but jerky and coffee. He built this empire with his own hands and the blood of anyone foolish enough to try taking it from him. "He sounds dangerous." "He was. Still is, when he needs to be." Martha poured more tea. "But then he met Emily." The name hung in the air like smoke. "She was a teacher, come west from Boston to bring civilization to the frontier, refined, educated, completely unsuited for this life." Martha's smile was sad, and Rowan fell for her like a tree falling, all at once, without warning, and hard enough to shake the ground. Within 6 months, they were married. Within a year, she was dead. Ella's hands tightened around her teacup. "What happened?" "Childbirth. The baby, too." Martha's voice went flat, clinical. "Complications. Dr. Morrison did everything he could, but some things can't be saved no matter how hard you fight. Rowan, he broke. Spent 3 months alone in the North Range, barely eating, not talking to anyone. When he came back, he was different, harder, more closed off. He threw himself into the ranch even more than before, like if he just worked hard enough, he could outrun the grief." "That's why he doesn't want me here," Ella said slowly, understanding crystallizing. "I remind him. You and that baby remind him of everything he lost, and he's terrified." Martha met Ella's eyes across the table. "Terrified that if he lets himself care again, even a little, he'll lose you too. That this place will take you the way it took them." The weight of it settled over Ella like a blanket. She thought about the carved horse, the hourly checks, the careful distance. Rowan Carter was trying to save them by pushing them away. "That's not fair to him," Ella said quietly. "He can't live like that. Always afraid, always alone." "No," Martha agreed. "He can't, but no one's been able to convince him otherwise." She studied Ella with new assessment. "Maybe no one's tried hard enough." Ella shook her head. "I'm nobody to him. A stranger he rescued. You're a mother who survived fire for her child. You're a woman who asked to work instead of accepting charity. You're someone who looked at the most feared man in the territory and saw a person worth thanking." Martha leaned forward. "You're not nobody, Ella Hartley, and I think deep down, Rowan knows that." The conversation stayed with Ella as the days passed, and her body continued to heal. She began taking walks around the compound, Jonah strapped against her chest in a sling Martha fashioned from spare cloth. The ranch hands tipped their hats as she passed, their initial wariness giving way to friendly nods. She learned their names: Old Pete, who managed the horses, young Tommy, who'd brought her the carved horse, Sam the foreman, who ran the operation when Rowan was occupied. And she watched Rowan. He moved through his empire with the confidence of a king, but she noticed things now that she'd missed before. The way his jaw tightened when he saw her with Jonah. The way his steps slowed as he passed the window of her room. The way he carved. Sitting on the porch in the evening, his knife moving with hypnotic precision, creating figures he never showed anyone. On the 8th night, Ella found him there, sitting in the darkness with a piece of pine and a sharp blade. She settled into the chair beside him without asking permission, Jonah asleep against her shoulder. "You're avoiding me," she said conversationally. Rowan's knife stilled. "I'm giving you space." "I don't want space. I want to understand." "There's nothing to understand. Martha told me about Emily." The knife slipped. Rowan cursed softly, bringing his thumb to his mouth where a thin line of blood welled. When he pulled it away, his expression was darker than the night around them. "Martha talks too much." "She cares about you. Someone should." Ella kept her voice gentle but firm. "You saved my life, Rowan. The least you can do is let me try to save yours." He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "I don't need saving." "Everyone needs saving from something. You're drowning in guilt and grief, and you're so afraid of losing anyone else that you won't let anyone get close enough to matter." She shifted Jonah to her other shoulder, feeling his warm weight, his steady breathing. "That's not living. That's just existing. Existing is safer." "Safer for who? You're miserable." "I'm fine." "You're carving toys for my son in the dark and checking his breathing every hour like you're waiting for death to come claim him." Ella's voice cracked. "That's not fine. That's torture." Rowan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against wood. He moved to the porch railing, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. "You should leave," he said finally. "As soon as you're able. I'll give you money, enough to set yourself up somewhere, buy a house, maybe start a business. You'll never have to worry about survival again. But you need to go." "Why?" "Because I can't—" He stopped, his hands gripping the railing hard enough that Ella heard wood creak. "I can't do this again. Can't care about someone and watch them leave. Can't let myself hope that maybe this time things will be different." Ella stood slowly, carefully, and moved to stand beside him. Not touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence. "I'm not asking you to hope," she said softly. "I'm just asking you to let us stay. Not forever. Just until we figure out where to go next. Let Jonah grow strong. Let me heal properly. And maybe," she swallowed hard, "maybe let yourself heal too." Rowan turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his face was all sharp angles and shadows. But his eyes, God, his eyes held so much pain it nearly broke her. "I don't know how," he whispered. "Then we'll figure it out together." It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of forever. It was simply an offer, one damaged soul extending a hand to another in the darkness. Ella didn't know if he'd take it, didn't know if he could. But when Rowan's hand slowly, carefully covered hers on the railing, she felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the possibility of hope. And sometimes that was enough to start healing. They stood together in the darkness, a widower and a widow, a man haunted by guilt and a woman with nothing left to lose. Behind them, the house glowed with lamplight. Around them, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizons they couldn't see. And between them, something fragile and unnamed began to grow. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. The autumn weeks that followed moved with the slow rhythm of healing and careful trust. Ella established a routine that gave her purpose without overstepping the invisible boundaries Rowan had drawn around himself. She helped Martha in the kitchen each morning, learning to cook for a household of ranch hands who ate like they were preparing for winter hibernation. Her hands, soft from months of isolated cabin life, developed calluses from kneading bread and scrubbing cast iron. The work felt good, honest and uncomplicated in ways her life hadn't been for years. Jonah thrived in the ranch environment, growing plumper and more alert with each passing day. The carved horse became his constant companion, clutched in pudgy fists that were just learning to grasp. Old Pete claimed the baby had horse sense after Jonah stopped crying the moment he was carried near the stables. Young Tommy fashioned a small cradle that could be set safely in the kitchen corner, allowing Ella to work while keeping her son close. And Rowan watched from a distance that was slowly, imperceptibly shrinking. He no longer disappeared when Ella entered a room. Stopped making excuses to avoid mealtimes when she sat at the long kitchen table with Martha and whatever ranch hands had business in the house. Once, she caught him holding Jonah while Martha tied her apron, the baby's small hand wrapped around Rowan's scarred finger, and the expression on the man's face was so nakedly vulnerable it made her chest ache. But the progress was fragile as spun glass. One wrong word, one moment of too much intimacy, and Rowan would retreat behind his walls for days. 3 weeks after the fire, a letter arrived. Sam brought it to the kitchen where Ella was peeling potatoes, his weathered face creased with concern. "This came for the boss, but—" He hesitated, turning the envelope over in his hands. "It's from Clay Mortensen. Nothing good ever comes from that man." Ella's hand stilled on the potato. She knew the Mortensen name, had heard it whispered in Redemption Creek with the same mixture of fear and disgust people reserve for rattlesnakes and outlaws. Clay Mortensen owned the second largest spread in the territory, built his fortune on intimidation and legal manipulation, and had made his intentions toward her property clear in the months before the fire. "What does he want with Rowan?" "Nothing good," Sam repeated. He set the letter on the table like it might bite. "You should know, Mortensen's been sniffing around your old property. What's left of it?" Ella's stomach dropped. Why would he care? It's nothing but ash now. It's got water rights. Copper Creek runs right through it. Sam's expression was grim. "Water's worth more than gold out here, ma'am. And Mortensen's been trying to corner the Eastern Valley water for years. Your husband's claim was the last piece he didn't control." "Thomas is dead. Ella swallowed hard. "I can't hold a claim, can I?" "As his widow? Maybe. Depends on how the paperwork was filed, whether there's a will, lot of legal tangles." Sam scratched his jaw. "But Mortensen doesn't care about legal. He'll file his own claim, bribe whoever needs bribing, and have it sewn up before you can hire a lawyer, assuming you could afford one." "I can't." The admission burned. "I don't have anything." The boss would help, if you asked. But asking felt impossible. Rowan had already given so much, her life, shelter, safety, time for healing. How could she ask him to fight her legal battles too? How could she become more of a burden than she already was? The kitchen door banged open before she could respond. Rowan strode in with the purposeful energy that meant trouble, his face darker than thunderclouds. He grabbed the letter from the table without preamble, ripped it open, and read with a jaw so tight Ella could see the muscle jumping. "Son of a bitch," he said quietly. Martha looked up from the stove. "What does that snake want now?" "He's claiming Ella's property. Says as an unattached woman with no means of working the land, she's forfeited her rights. He's filed papers with the territorial office." Rowan crumpled the letter in his fist. "And he's invited me to discuss reasonable compensation for her loss." "That's not legal," Sam protested. "She's got 6 months to establish residence after—" "It's legal enough if you own the right judges." Rowan's eyes, when they found Ella's, were storm gray and furious. "He knows you're here, knows you've got no money, no lawyer, no way to fight him. He's betting I won't get involved in someone else's property dispute." Ella's throat had gone dry. "You shouldn't. It's not your problem." "The hell it isn't." Rowan moved toward her with that predatory grace, and she found herself pressing back against the counter even though nothing in his posture threatened her. "That land is yours by right. Your husband died on it. You nearly died defending it. And Mortensen thinks he can just take it because you're a woman alone?" His voice had gone deadly soft. "No." "Rowan." She tried to make her voice steady, rational. "I appreciate what you're saying, but it's 40 acres of burned ground. It's not worth fighting over." "It's not about the land." He was close enough now that she could see the fury burning behind his careful control. "It's about Mortensen thinking he can take whatever he wants from whoever's too weak to stop him. It's about predators and prey, and I'll be damned before I let you be prey." Something in Ella's chest twisted painfully. "I'm not asking you to fight for me." "You don't have to ask." Rowan's hand came up, almost touching her face before he caught himself and let it drop. But I need you to let me. Please. The pleas nearly broke her. This man who commanded an empire, who bent weather and men to his will, was asking permission to protect her. Not taking, not assuming, asking. Okay? She whispered. Okay. The tension in Rowan's shoulders eased fractionally. He nodded once, sharp and decisive, then turned to Sam. Get the lawyer from Cheyenne. The good one, not the drunk we used for the fence dispute. I want every filing Mortensen made pulled and reviewed. If there's a crack in his claim, I want it found. Yes, sir. Sam headed for the door, then paused. Boss, Mortensen's not going to take this lying down. I'm counting on it. Rowan's smile was all edges. Been a while since anyone gave me a good reason to remind this territory why they leave Carterland alone. After Sam left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the kitchen. Martha had gone conspicuously quiet at the stove, giving them the illusion of privacy while absolutely listening to every word. Jonah chose that moment to wake from his nap with a small cry that shattered the tension. Ella moved to pick him up, but Rowan was faster. He lifted the baby with surprising gentleness, settling Jonah against his chest with the ease of long practice. The baby immediately stopped fussing, one small hand grabbing a fistful of Rowan's shirt. Hey there, little man, Rowan murmured. Bad dream? Ella watched them, this hard man and her soft baby, and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope, maybe, or longing, or the terrible realization that she was starting to depend on Rowan Carter in ways that went far beyond gratitude. I'll pay you back, she said quietly. Somehow, when I figure out how. Rowan looked up, Jonah still cradled against him. You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything. My life, my son's life, now my land. Your land was always yours. I'm just making sure it stays that way. He shifted Jonah to his shoulder, patting the baby's back with automatic rhythm. Besides, taking on Mortensen's not exactly a hardship. Man's been asking for a reckoning for years. This isn't about your feud with him. Ella moved closer, needing him to understand. This is about me not being a charity case you need to rescue every time something goes wrong. Maybe I'm starting to think rescue isn't the worst thing I could do with my time. Rowan's voice had gone soft, almost wondering. Maybe having someone to protect is better than having no one at all. Before Ella could respond, before she could parse what exactly that meant, the sound of hooves thundering into the yard shattered the moment. Multiple riders, moving fast. Sam's voice rose in sharp challenge, followed by answering shouts. Rowan's entire demeanor changed in an instant. He handed Jonah to Ella with quick efficiency, his hand already moving to the gun belt he wore even inside his own house. Stay here. Lock the door behind me. What's happening? Don't know, but it's happening fast. He was already moving toward the door. Martha, get her upstairs, away from windows. Then he was gone, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the dishes. Through the window, Ella saw 5 riders milling in the yard. Not Mortensen's men by their dress, but strangers wearing hard faces and harder eyes, the kind of men who got paid to cause trouble. Martha grabbed Ella's arm. Come on, now. But Rowan can handle himself. You're the one he'll tear this territory apart for if something happens. Move. They hurried upstairs, Martha surprisingly spry for her age. She ushered Ella into the bedroom and positioned them away from the window, but where they could still see the yard below. Jonah had started to cry, picking up on his mother's fear with that uncanny infant intuition, and Ella bounced him frantically while trying to see what was happening. Rowan stood in the center of the yard, flanked by Sam and 3 other ranch hands. The strangers had dismounted but kept their hands near their weapons. The lead rider, a barrel-chested man with a red face and cruel eyes, was talking, gesturing aggressively. Ella couldn't hear the words, but she could read the threat in every movement. Who are they? She whispered. Trouble. Martha's face was grim. The big one's Cutter Wade. Used to be a buffalo hunter before he killed them all. Now he hires out to whoever pays best. Her hands twisted in her apron. Mortensen must have sent them. But why? Rowan just got the letter an hour ago. Because Mortensen knows how Rowan will react. He sent the letter as a courtesy, letting Rowan know what's coming. And these men, Martha's voice dropped. These men are what's coming. In the yard, the conversation had escalated. Rowan's posture hadn't changed, still loose, still controlled, but something about him had shifted. He looked like violence, waiting for permission. One of the strangers made the mistake of stepping too close, and Rowan's hand moved to his gun with snake-strike speed. "Don't," Ella breathed. "Please don't." But the tension held without breaking. Whatever Rowan said made the stranger step back, hands raised in mock surrender. More words exchanged, heated but not lethal. Then the strangers were mounting up, Cutter Wade pointing one thick finger at Rowan in what looked like a promise. The riders left at the same unhurried pace they'd arrived, like men who'd accomplished their purpose and saw no need to rush. As soon as they cleared the gate, Rowan turned and strode back toward the house, his face carved from granite. Martha moved toward the door. "I'll go see—" "No." Ella surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "Let me." She found Rowan in his study, standing at the window with his back to the door, both hands braced against the frame like he was holding up the wall or holding himself back from tearing it down. "You should be upstairs," he said without turning. "I should be wherever I decide to be." Ella closed the door softly. What did they want? To deliver a message from Mortensen. Very simple message. Rowan's voice was controlled to the point of brittleness. "Leave your land claim alone or he'll make things difficult." Difficult how? The kind of difficult that ends with people getting hurt. Now he did turn, and the fury in his eyes made Ella's breath catch. "He's threatening you, not directly. He's too smart for that. But the implication was clear. Drop the fight, or accidents might happen to the woman and baby staying on Carter Ranch." The words hit like a physical blow. Ella's arms tightened around Jonah instinctively. "He can't." "He can, and he will." Rowan crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just short of touching her. "Mortensen doesn't make threats he won't follow through on. And he knows the one thing I can't defend against is fear. Knows that if you're scared enough, you'll leave. And once you're gone, you're vulnerable. So what do we do?" "We?" Rowan's laugh was bitter. "There is no we. You pack up, take the money I'll give you, and disappear. Change your name, go back east, somewhere Mortensen can't reach you. Run away. Survive." His hands came up, hovering near her shoulders, but not quite touching, like he couldn't decide between pulling her close or pushing her away. "I can protect you here, but only if you stay on this ranch. The moment you step off Carter land, you're exposed. And I can't—" His voice cracked. "I can't watch another person I care about die because of my pride." There it was, the admission he'd been avoiding for weeks. "I care about." Past tense would have been safer, more distant, but present tense meant something, meant this wasn't just about Emily or guilt or penance. This was about them. "I'm not leaving," Ella said quietly. "You have to." "I won't." "Ella," her name sounded like a prayer and a curse. "Please, for Jonah, for yourself, just go. And let Mortensen win? Let him take my land, threaten my family, and face no consequences because running is easier than fighting?" She shifted Jonah to one arm and reached up with her free hand to touch Rowan's face, the first time she'd deliberately touched him since that night on the porch. His skin was warm beneath her palm, rough with late-day stubble. "You told me once that this place takes things from people, but maybe it's time to take something back." Rowan's hand came up to cover hers, pressing it against his cheek. His eyes closed briefly, and when they opened, the vulnerability there nearly destroyed her. "I can't lose you," he whispered. "I can't go through that again." "Then don't lose. Fight." Ella's thumb traced the scar on his cheekbone. "You said you wanted someone to protect. Well, here we are. Protect us by making sure Mortensen knows we're not prey. We're not victims. We're Carter Ranch, and we don't run." Something shifted in Rowan's expression, the fear giving way to something harder, more resolved. His other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "You're asking me to start a war. I'm asking you to finish one." She held his gaze, letting him see her certainty. "Mortensen started this when he came after a widow and her baby. All I'm asking is that you end it." For a long moment, Rowan just looked at her, really looked, like he was seeing her for the first time. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, but we do this smart. No rushing in, no confrontations until we know what we're dealing with. His hands dropped from her face, and Ella felt the loss like cold water. And you stay on this property. No trips to town, no visits to what's left of your cabin, nothing. You and Jonah are safest here, where I can keep eyes on you every second. That's fine. More than fine. Ella had nowhere else she wanted to be. The next 3 days passed in tense preparation. The lawyer from Cheyenne arrived, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Wells, who took one look at Mortenson's claim and pronounced it aggressive but not airtight. She set up operations in the dining room, spreading papers and legal documents across the table while muttering about territorial jurisdiction and precedent challenges. Sam doubled the watch rotations, putting men on alert at all hours. The ranch took on a military atmosphere, weapons cleaned and ready, eyes constantly scanning the horizon, conversations conducted in low voices that stopped whenever Ella entered a room. And Rowan was everywhere and nowhere. He checked the perimeter himself each morning and evening, rode out with small groups of men on mysterious errands, spent hours in his study with Catherine reviewing strategy. But he also appeared in the kitchen at odd moments, watching Ella work with an intensity that made her hands shake. Brought her a new shawl when the nights turned cold. Carved a second horse for Jonah. This one smaller, smoother, perfect for tiny hands. On the third night, Ella woke to the sound of horses. Not the ranch horses in their corrals, but riders approaching fast and hard. She grabbed Jonah from his cradle and ran to the window in time to see torches, 4, 5, 6 of them, moving through the darkness toward the eastern pasture. Fire. The word stopped her heart. They were going to burn the ranch the way the wildfire had burned her cabin. Going to destroy everything Rowan had built, everyone he protected, all because he dared to defend her claim. She was pulling on clothes with frantic speed when the bedroom door burst open. Martha stood there, already dressed, her face grim. Come with me. Now. There's a root cellar under the kitchen, stone walls, reinforced door. You'll be safe there. What about Rowan, the men? Are handling it. Martha grabbed Ella's arm, propelling her toward the door. Your job is to keep that baby safe and not give the boss one more thing to worry about. Move. They made it to the kitchen just as the first gunshot cracked through the night. Jonah wailed, and Ella clutched him tighter while Martha hauled open a trap door hidden beneath a woven rug. Stone steps led down into darkness. There's lanterns, water, blankets. Stay quiet. Stay down. Don't come out until someone you know comes for you. Martha's hands were shaking, but her voice stayed steady. Go. Martha. I've got things to do. Go. Ella descended into the cellar, hearing the trapdoor slam shut above her, the scrape of the rug being replaced. In the darkness, she fumbled for matches, found a lantern, got it lit with trembling hands. The cellar was exactly as Martha described, small but sturdy, stocked with emergency supplies, a tomb or a sanctuary, depending on how the night ended. More gunshots, shouting, the thunder of hooves. Jonah screamed with the particular intensity that meant terror, and Ella paced the small space, bouncing him, singing through tears, trying to be brave for the baby who needed her whole when she felt broken into pieces. The minutes stretched into hours. The sounds of conflict faded but didn't disappear entirely. Ella strained to hear details through stone walls. Was that Rowan's voice? Sam's? Or strangers come to burn them all? Finally, when Jonah had cried himself into exhausted sleep and Ella had worn a path in the dirt floor, she heard it. Footsteps above, the scrape of the rug, the trapdoor lifting. Ella? Rowan's voice, rough and hoarse. You down there? Yes. She nearly sobbed with relief. Yes, we're here. His face appeared in the opening, illuminated by lamplight from above. He was covered in soot and dirt, his shirt torn, a fresh cut bleeding along his jaw. But he was alive. Whole. Real. Come on up. It's over. Ella climbed the steps awkwardly, hampered by Jonah's weight and her own shaking legs. Rowan reached down to help, his hand warm and solid around hers. When she emerged into the kitchen, she found it crowded with ranch hands, all bearing similar signs of conflict, but all standing, all breathing, all alive. What happened? Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Mortenson's men tried to fire the east barn. Sam spoke from near the stove, wrapping a bandage around his forearm. We were waiting for them, ran them off before they could light it. Anyone hurt? Nothing serious. They weren't expecting resistance. Sam's grin was fierce. Won't make that mistake twice. Rowan's hand was still wrapped around Ella's, and he seemed to realize it at the same moment she did. He let go quickly, stepping back, but his eyes never left her face. You all right? The baby? We're fine. Scared, but fine. Ella looked around at the assembled men, at the evidence of battle defended and won. Thank you. All of you. Don't thank us yet, Sam said grimly. This was just the first move. Mortenson's going to escalate. Let him. Rowan's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. He wants to play this game. Will play. But he needs to understand something. His gaze swept the room, landing on each man in turn. This ranch protects its own, and Ella Hartley and her son are ours. Anyone who comes for them comes through every man here. Make sure that message reaches Mortenson. The men nodded, a murmur of agreement rippling through the kitchen. Ella felt something warm and terrifying bloom in her chest. Belonging, maybe. Or family. Or the dangerous realization that she'd stopped thinking of this place as temporary shelter and started thinking of it as home. The next morning brought a new development. Catherine Wells emerged from the dining room with papers in hand and triumph in her eyes. I found it, she announced. The loophole. Rowan looked up from his breakfast. Found what? Mortenson's claim is based on abandonment. Says Mrs. Hartley left the property undefended and therefore forfeited her rights. Catherine spread the documents across the table. But Wyoming territorial law requires 6 months of complete abandonment before land can be reclaimed. Mrs. Hartley's only been gone 3 weeks. And more importantly, she didn't abandon, she was forced to flee due to natural disaster, which has specific protections written into the homestead provisions. So the claim doesn't hold? Ella's heart hammered against her ribs. Not just that, I can file a counterclaim citing intimidation and harassment. Catherine's smile was sharp as broken glass. If I can prove Mortenson's men threatened you, which we can, given last night's attack, he's not just losing the claim, he's opening himself up to criminal charges. He'll deny everything, Sam said. Claim his men were acting independently. Probably, but it puts him on the defensive, forces him to explain why his hired guns keep showing up on Carter property making threats. Catherine gathered her papers with satisfaction. Even if nothing sticks criminally, the legal challenges will tie up his claim for months. Maybe years. Rowan leaned back in his chair, something dangerous flickering behind his eyes. Unless we give him a reason to withdraw the claim voluntarily. What kind of reason? Ella asked. The kind that reminds him there are consequences to threatening what's mine. The way he said mine, possessive and absolute, sent shivers down Ella's spine. This was the man who'd built an empire through will and violence, and she was watching him decide that she and Jonah were part of that empire now, part of what he'd defend with everything he had. It should have scared her. Instead, it felt like safety. What are you planning? Catherine's eyes narrowed with professional wariness. Nothing illegal, just persuasive. Rowan stood, decision made. Sam, I need 5 men. Good riders, not afraid of hard work. We're paying a visit to Mortenson's water operation at Blue Canyon. Sam's grin was feral. Sabotage? Renegotiation. Rowan's smile matched his foreman's. Mortenson's been running pipes from that canyon to his southern pastures for 2 years without proper permits. I've got copies of the territorial survey maps. If those pipes happen to be on land that's still technically open range. He shrugged. Well, that's a conversation he and I need to have. You're going to threaten his water supply, Ella understood with sudden clarity. Fight fire with fire. I'm going to remind him that empires are fragile things. Rowan moved toward her, and everyone else in the kitchen suddenly found reasons to be very interested in their breakfast, and that men who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones or torches. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Jonah, sensing adult tension, reached out from Ella's arms toward Rowan with grasping fingers. Without thinking, Rowan took the baby, settling him against his chest with practiced ease. "I'll be gone 2 days," he said quietly, his attention split between Ella and the child he held. "Maybe 3. Sam's in charge. You stay inside, stay armed. Don't take chances." "I don't know how to shoot." "Then Sam will teach you. Today." It wasn't a suggestion. "I won't have you defenseless if something happens while I'm gone." "Nothing's going to happen." "Probably not. But probably isn't certain, and I need certain." His free hand came up to touch her face, just a brief brush of fingers against her cheek, there and gone so fast she might have imagined it. "I need to know you can protect yourself and this boy if I'm not here." "Why?" Ella whispered. "Why does it matter so much?" Rowan looked at her for a long moment, Jonah contentedly grabbing fistfuls of his shirt, the morning light painting them all in shades of gold and shadow. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "Because somewhere between pulling you out of that fire and watching you stand up to men who wanted you broken, I stopped seeing you as someone I saved and started seeing you as someone I can't live without. And that terrifies me more than any number of Mortenson's hired guns." He handed Jonah back to her with careful gentleness. "So you're going to learn to shoot, and I'm going to make sure Clay Mortenson understands that you're under Carter protection now. Permanently." He was gone before she could respond, striding out of the kitchen with Sam at his heels, already barking orders about supplies and weapons and travel plans. Ella stood frozen with Jonah in her arms, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must hear it. Martha materialized at her elbow, a knowing smile playing at her weathered face. "Well," the older woman said conversationally, "that's the most I've heard him say about his feelings in 6 years. You must be special." "I'm nobody special. You're special to him. That's what matters." Martha took Jonah gently, freeing Ella's shaking hands. "Now, you've got 2 days to learn to shoot before the boss gets back. I'd suggest you pay attention to Sam's lessons. That man may be rough around the edges, but he can put 6 bullets through a silver dollar at 50 paces. Ella nodded numbly, still processing Rowan's words. Someone I can't live without. How had she become that? How had a stranger who'd saved her from fire become someone whose absence made the world feel unsteady? But she knew the answer. It was in the carved horses and the hourly checks on Jonah's breathing. It was in the way Rowan looked at her like she was simultaneously his salvation and his doom. It was in the fact that he'd chosen to fight for her land, not because of justice or pride, but because letting her be threatened was unthinkable. Somewhere between survival and safety, between gratitude and trust, Ella Hartley had fallen for Rowan Carter. And judging by the fierce protectiveness burning in his eyes, by the way he held her baby like the child was his own, by his willingness to start a war rather than let her go, he'd fallen too. Now they just had to survive long enough to figure out what that meant. Sam proved to be a patient if demanding teacher. That afternoon, he set up targets in a clearing well away from the main buildings and handed Ella a revolver that felt impossibly heavy in her inexperienced hands. "First rule," he said, positioning himself behind her to adjust her grip. "Respect the weapon. It's not a toy. It's not a threat. It's a tool that does exactly one thing, and you need to be damn sure you want that thing done before you pull the trigger." Ella's hands trembled as she tried to hold the gun steady. "I don't know if I can." "Can't or won't." Sam's voice was firm but not unkind. "Because if Mortenson's men come through that door while the boss is gone, you're going to have about 3 seconds to decide if you're willing to protect that baby. This isn't about being comfortable. It's about being capable." He was right. Ella thought about Jonah sleeping peacefully in the house, about Rowan riding into danger to protect them, about the men who'd tried to burn the barn with all of them inside. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Show me again," she said, forcing steel into her voice. By sunset, her ears rang from the gunshots and her arms ached from the recoil, but she could hit a man-sized target 3 times out of 5 at close range. Not perfect, but enough. Sam pronounced her adequate for desperate circumstances, which Ella chose to take as a compliment. That night, she lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar silence of Rowan's absence. The house felt different without him in it, less solid somehow, as if his presence was part of the foundation. Martha had assured her the men would be fine, that Rowan had survived far worse than a confrontation with Clay Mortenson, But worry gnawed at Ella's stomach anyway. She'd come to depend on him. Worse, she'd come to need him. And need was dangerous for a woman who'd learned the hard way that everyone you needed eventually left. The first day passed with agonizing slowness. Ella threw herself into work, helping Martha with laundry and mending, playing with Jonah until the baby's giggles chased away some of her anxiety. Catherine Wells continued her legal battle from the dining room, emerging periodically to ask questions about Thomas's original claim filing and water rights documentation that Ella couldn't answer. "I never paid attention to the paperwork," she admitted, feeling foolish. "Thomas handled all of that." "Most wives don't," Catherine said without judgment. "That's going to change, though. Women are starting to file claims in their own names, manage their own properties. You should consider doing the same once we get this settled." The idea was both terrifying and thrilling. Ella had spent her entire adult life depending on men. Her father, then Thomas, now Rowan. What would it mean to depend only on herself? The second day brought rain, a cold, persistent drizzle that turned the yard to mud and kept everyone inside and restless. The ranch hands gathered in the bunkhouse, their laughter and card games drifting across the compound. Martha baked bread with aggressive efficiency, pounding the dough like it had personally offended her. And Ella paced the house with Jonah on her hip, checking the windows compulsively for riders that never appeared. It was full dark when they finally came. Ella was nursing Jonah in the rocking chair by the fire when she heard it. Hooves, but wrong. Not the confident thunder of Carter ranch horses, but something quieter, more cautious. The sound of men trying not to be heard. She was on her feet in an instant, settling Jonah into his cradle and grabbing the revolver Sam had insisted she keep close. Her heart hammered so loud she was sure it would give her away as she moved to the window, careful to stay in shadow. 3 riders. Maybe 4. Hard to tell in the darkness and rain. They'd stopped at the gate, and one had dismounted to examine the lock. Not Mortenson's men by their silhouettes. These riders sat their horses differently, moved with military precision that spoke of training beyond what hired guns usually possessed. Ella's mouth went dry. She had to warn the others, had to... The kitchen door creaked open below. Martha's voice called up the stairs, deliberately calm. "Ella, dear, could you come down, please? We have visitors." Visitors. The word was wrong, too polite for the threat outside, but Martha's tone carried a warning Ella couldn't ignore. She checked that the revolver's safety was off. Sam had drilled that into her, and made her way downstairs with the weapon hidden in the folds of her skirt. The kitchen was crowded. Sam stood near the door with 3 ranch hands, all armed. Martha was at the stove, her back rigid with tension. And seated at the table, dripping rainwater onto the clean floor, was a man Ella had never seen before. He was younger than Rowan, maybe 35, with the lean build of someone who spent more time riding than eating. His clothes were quality, not ranch wear, but traveling clothes that had seen better days. He held a hat in his hands and stood when Ella entered, a gesture of respect that didn't match the circumstances of his arrival. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, his voice surprisingly cultured. "My name is James Preston. I work for the Territorial Marshal's office." Ella's grip on the hidden revolver tightened. "What do you want?" "To ask some questions about Clay Mortenson." Preston gestured to the chair across from him. "May I?" Sam spoke before Ella could respond. "The boss ain't here. You want to ask questions? You wait until he gets back." "I'm aware Mr. Carter is currently traveling. That's actually why I'm here now." Preston's smile was thin. "I need to speak with Mrs. Hartley without his influence." "My presence isn't influenced by anyone," Ella said sharply, "and I don't appreciate the implication. No offense intended, but you're living on Carter property under Carter protection. That creates complications when we're investigating claims of harassment and intimidation." Preston pulled out a notebook, flipping through pages marked with cramped handwriting. "Clay Mortenson filed a complaint 3 days ago. Says Rowan Carter has been making threats, intimidating his workers, and engaging in what he calls aggressive territorial behavior." "That's a lie." The words burst from Ella before she could stop them. "Is it? Because Mr. Carter did ride out to Blue Canyon with armed men. He did have a rather heated conversation with Mortenson's water crew, and he did make statements that could be interpreted as threatening Mortenson's operations." Mortensen tried to burn this ranch. Ella's voice rose despite her attempt to stay calm. His men attacked us, threatened my child, and you're here investigating Rowan? Preston's expression didn't change. I'm here investigating the facts. Mortensen claims his men were defending his property rights. Claims the fire was an accident, that his crew was chased off before they could explain themselves. That's... Ella bit off the curse, aware of Jonah sleeping upstairs. That's not what happened. Then tell me what did happen, from the beginning. Preston's pen was poised above his notebook. And please understand, Mrs. Hartley, I'm trying to get to the truth here. If Mortensen is lying, I need evidence. But if Carter's operating outside the law, even for good reasons, I need to know that too. Ella looked at Sam, who gave her a tiny nod. Permission, or maybe encouragement. She took a breath and began talking. She told him everything, the fire that destroyed her cabin, Rowan's rescue, Mortensen's claim on her land, the letter, the threats, the men with torches in the night. She spoke carefully, sticking to facts, aware that every word might be used to help or hurt the man who'd saved her life. Preston listened without interruption, his pen moving steadily across the pages. When Ella finished, he closed the notebook and studied her with uncomfortably sharp eyes. You care about him, he said. Not a question. That's not relevant to your investigation. It's relevant to your testimony. If there's a romantic relationship, it compromises your credibility as a witness. Heat flooded Ella's face. There is no relationship. Mr. Carter has been nothing but honorable. But you want there to be. Preston's smile was knowing. I'm not judging, Mrs. Hartley. God knows if a man pulled me from a fire and fought my battles, I'd probably feel something too. I just need to know where the facts end and the feelings begin. The facts, Ella said coldly, are that Clay Mortensen is a bully who preys on people weaker than himself, and Rowan Carter is a man who is willing to stand up to that bully when no one else would. If that makes him a criminal in your eyes, then your definition of justice is badly broken. Preston studied her for a long moment, then surprisingly smiled. Fair enough. For what it's worth, Mrs. Hartley, I don't think Carter's the villain here, but I have to follow the complaints I receive, even when they come from men like Mortensen. He stood, tucking the notebook into his jacket. I'll file my report. It'll note that you and multiple witnesses corroborate the threats and arson attempt. Should help your lawyer with the land claim. Will it stop Mortensen? That depends on Carter. Preston moved toward the door, then paused. Tell him when he gets back. Tell him I said the law's on his side this time. But there's a line between defending what's yours and becoming what you're fighting against. He needs to stay on the right side of it. After the marshal and his men rode off, Sam locked the door with particular emphasis. Boss ain't gonna like that the law came sniffing around while he was gone. Boss isn't here, Martha said tartly. Ella handled it just fine. But Ella wasn't sure she had. She replayed the conversation in her mind, wondering what she should have said differently, what details might matter. Preston had seemed sympathetic, but lawmen were trained to seem sympathetic while gathering evidence. What if she'd said something that could be used against Rowan? The worry carried her through a sleepless night and into the next morning. By noon, she was exhausted and jumpy, startling at every sound. Martha finally ordered her to take a nap, promising to watch Jonah and wake her if anything happened. Ella was climbing the stairs when she heard it. Horses again, but different this time. Familiar. She ran to the window, and her heart leaped at the sight of Rowan riding through the gate, Sam beside him, all 5 men accounted for, and apparently unharmed. She was down the stairs and out the door before she'd consciously decided to move, propriety forgotten in the rush of relief. Rowan dismounted as she reached him, and for a heartbeat they just stared at each other, this man and woman who'd become essential to one another without quite meaning to. You're back, Ella said stupidly. I'm back. Rowan's eyes traveled over her face like he was checking for damage. Everything all right here? Yes. No, the marshal came. She saw him stiffen, saw the instant calculation in his eyes. I talked to him, told him everything. He said the law's on your side. Some of the tension left Rowan's shoulders. Good. That's good. He handed his reins to young Tommy, never taking his eyes off Ella. We should talk. Inside. They walked to his study in silence, heavy with unspoken things. Once the door closed behind them, Rowan moved to the window, his usual position when he needed distance to think clearly. Mortensen withdrew his claim, he said abruptly. Signed papers this morning, filed them with the territorial office by noon. Your land is yours, free and clear. The words should have brought joy, relief, celebration. Instead, Ella felt strangely hollow. What did you do? Had a conversation. Rowan's voice was carefully neutral. Showed him some survey maps. Mentioned that his water pipes ran through territory he didn't actually own. Suggested that if he continued to harass people under my protection, those pipes might develop unfortunate leaks. You threatened him. I negotiated. Now he did turn to face her. There's a difference. Is there? The marshal said, I know what the marshal said. Preston's a good man, tries to do things by the book. But sometimes the book doesn't account for men like Mortensen who use legal systems as weapons. Rowan's jaw was tight. I did what needed doing. No one got hurt. Mortensen keeps his water. You keep your land. Everyone walks away intact. Except now he hates you even more. He already hated me. At least now he fears me too. Rowan moved closer, his expression softening slightly. Ella, this is how things work out here. The law only reaches so far. After that, it's will and strength and being willing to do what others won't. I know. And she did. She'd lived in Wyoming long enough to understand the brutal mathematics of frontier justice, but understanding didn't make it easier to accept. I don't want you becoming something you're not because of me. I became what I am long before I met you. His hand came up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear with unexpected gentleness. You didn't make me hard. You're just making me remember what it feels like to have something worth being hard for. The words hit her like a physical blow, intimate and raw and more honest than anything he'd said before. Ella's breath caught, and she saw the exact moment Rowan realized what he'd revealed. He started to pull back, to retreat behind his walls, but she caught his hand before he could. Don't, she whispered. Don't run away. Not this time. Ella, you said you can't live without me. Do you remember? Right before you left. She stepped closer, closing the distance he'd tried to create. Did you mean it? Rowan's eyes were storm gray and full of things he clearly wasn't ready to say. You know I meant it. Then stop acting like I'm going to disappear if you let yourself care. Her free hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling the rapid hammer of his heart beneath her palm. I'm not Emily. I'm not fragile or breakable. I survived fire. I survived Thomas's death. I survived losing everything. And I'm still here. I'm still standing. I'm not going anywhere. You might not have a choice. His voice was rough, pained. This life, it takes people, Ella. It took Emily, took our child, took that boy. And I couldn't, he swallowed hard. I couldn't stop any of it. Couldn't protect them no matter how hard I tried. So you think the answer is not trying at all? Just pushing everyone away and being alone? Ella's eyes burned with unshed tears. That's not protection, Rowan. That's just cowardice. The word landed like a slap. Rowan's entire body went rigid, his hand pulling free from hers. You don't understand. I understand grief. I understand loss. My husband put a bullet in his head and left me with a baby and $40 to survive on. I understand feeling abandoned and broken and like the world is actively trying to destroy you. Her voice cracked. But I also understand that giving up on connection, on family, on love, that's just another way of dying. A slower way, maybe. But just as final. Love. Rowan repeated the word like it was foreign. Is that what you think this is? I don't know what to call it. Ella's hands fisted in her skirt to keep from reaching for him again. But I know that when you rode out to face Mortensen, I couldn't breathe until you came back. I know that Jonah reaches for you the way babies reach for their fathers. I know that this place only feels like home when you're in it. She forced herself to meet his eyes. So call it whatever you want, but don't tell me it doesn't exist. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension and possibility. Rowan looked at her like she was something miraculous and terrifying, like she'd just handed him salvation with one hand and damnation with the other. "If I let myself feel this," he said slowly, each word costing him, "if I let you and that baby become what I think you already are to me, and then something happens, if I lose you the way I've lost everyone else, it will destroy me, completely. There won't be anything left to rebuild. And if you don't let yourself feel it," Ella took a step closer, "if you push us away, and we leave like you want, and you spend the rest of your life alone in this big house wondering what might have been, will that destroy you any less?" She saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke it, the truth that he'd been running from since the moment he'd pulled her from that fire. He was already destroyed by loneliness, already broken by isolation. The only question was whether he'd let someone help put the pieces back together. "I don't know how," Rowan whispered. "How to do this. How to be this." "Neither do I." Ella's hand found his again, threading their fingers together. "But maybe we can figure it out together. Maybe that's what family is. People who don't have all the answers but refuse to give up on each other anyway." Rowan's other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with devastating tenderness. "You're asking me to be brave. I'm asking you to try. That's all. Just try." For a moment, Ella thought he might actually kiss her. She could see the want in his eyes, the way his gaze dropped to her mouth and his breath hitched. But instead, he pulled her into his arms. A fierce, desperate embrace that spoke of need and fear and stubborn hope all tangled together. "I'm not good at this," he said against her hair. "I'm going to mess it up. I'm going to be too protective, or too distant, or too broken. I survived fire, remember?" Ella's arms wrapped around his waist, holding him like she could keep him from running through sheer force of will. "I can handle difficult." They stood like that, wrapped in each other, while the afternoon light slanted through the windows and the ranch carried on around them. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of forever, but it was a beginning, a crack in the armor Rowan had built around his heart. And through that crack, something fragile and precious was starting to grow. The sound of a baby crying filtered down from upstairs. Ella pulled back reluctantly, already moving toward the door. "That's Jonah. He's probably hungry." "Wait," Rowan caught her hand. "After. Once he's settled. Come back, please." The please undid her. This man who commanded empires and faced down outlaws was asking, not demanding, asking for her company. Ella nodded, not trusting her voice, and hurried upstairs. She found Jonah red-faced and furious, his small fists waving in outrage at the injustice of having to wait for food. Ella settled into the rocking chair and began nursing him, her mind still replaying the conversation with Rowan. He'd admitted he cared, more than cared, needed, and she'd pushed him, hard, refusing to let him hide behind fear. Had she gone too far? Should she have been more patient, more understanding of his wounds? But patience hadn't gotten them here. Honesty had. Raw, uncomfortable honesty that forced them both to acknowledge what was building between them, whether they wanted it or not. "Your mother's falling for a cowboy," Ella whispered to Jonah. "And he's falling right back. What do you think about that?" Jonah's answer was to grab her finger and squeeze, his gray eyes, so like Thomas's but somehow entirely his own, watching her with that serious baby intensity. He didn't care about complications or broken hearts or the logistics of building a life with a man she barely knew. He only cared that his stomach was full and his mother was close and the world felt safe. Maybe that was the lesson. Maybe that was what Rowan needed to learn. That sometimes you had to trust in the present moment without worrying about every possible future disaster. That love wasn't about guarantees, it was about choosing someone despite the lack of them. By the time Jonah finished nursing and drifted into milk-drunk sleep, darkness had fallen outside. Ella changed him, tucked him into his cradle with the carved horse within reach, and made her way back downstairs. She found Rowan exactly where she'd left him, standing at the window like he'd been frozen there. But he turned when she entered, and the expression on his face made her heart stutter. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what you said. About cowardice." Ella winced. "I shouldn't have. You were right." He crossed to his desk, pulled out a drawer, and removed a small wooden box. "After Emily died, I put everything that reminded me of her in here. Letters, her wedding ring, a lock of hair. I told myself I was preserving memories, but really, I was just hiding, keeping the past locked away so I wouldn't have to feel it. He opened the box and Ella saw papers, a delicate gold band, a faded ribbon, the detritus of a life that had ended too soon. I loved her, Rowan continued, his voice steady but strained. She was good and kind and completely unsuited for this harsh life, and I loved her anyway. And when she died, I blamed myself. For bringing her here, for getting her pregnant, for not having a better doctor, for not— He stopped, swallowed hard. For not being enough to keep her alive. Rowan, let me finish, please. He set the box down. I've carried that guilt for 6 years. Used it as armor, as an excuse to never risk feeling that kind of pain again. And you're right, it was cowardice. Not protecting myself, just refusing to live. Ella moved closer, drawn by the rawness in his voice. But then you fell into my life, Rowan said, meeting her eyes. You and that baby, trapped in fire, needing someone to pull you out. And for the first time in 6 years, I felt something other than guilt and anger. I felt necessary. Like maybe all the darkness had a purpose if it made me strong enough to save you. You did save us. And you're saving me right back. His hand reached for hers, tentative as a first touch. By refusing to let me hide. By pushing me to feel things I thought were dead. By looking at me and seeing someone worth believing in despite all evidence to the contrary. Ella's throat was tight. I see who you are, not who you think you are. Then see this. Rowan took a breath, and Ella knew whatever came next would change everything. I want you to stay. Not as a guest, not as someone I'm protecting. I want you here permanently. You and Jonah. I want— He faltered, searching for words. I want to try to be what you need. What he needs. A family. A home. Something real that isn't built on guilt or obligation. What is it built on? Ella whispered. Hope, maybe. Choice. Definitely. And whatever this thing is between us that terrifies me and makes me feel alive at the same time. His thumb traced circles on her palm. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even sure I know what that means anymore. But I'm asking you to stay. To give me time to remember how to be human instead of just hard. Ella studied his face, all sharp angles and old scars, eyes that had seen too much violence and not enough tenderness. This man who'd ridden through fire for her, who carved toys in the dark, who was offering her everything he had left to give. I'll stay, she said simply, on one condition. Wariness flickered across Rowan's expression. What condition? You stop trying to earn me. Stop thinking you have to prove you deserve us being here. She stepped closer, close enough to feel his warmth. We're not a debt to be repaid or a responsibility to shoulder. We're people who care about you, and you're allowed to care back without thinking it makes you weak. Something in Rowan's face cracked, the last of his defenses finally crumbling. He pulled her against him with sudden desperation, his arms wrapping around her like she might disappear if he didn't hold tight enough. I do care, he said against her hair. God help me. I care so much it scares me senseless. Good. Ella's arm circled his waist. Being scared means it matters. Means you're alive enough to lose something. They held each other while the house settled around them, and the ranch carried on its eternal rhythms. Somewhere upstairs, Jonah slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that his mother was near. And in the study, two broken people began the slow, careful work of building something whole from their shattered pieces. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no kiss, no dramatic declaration of eternal love. Just two people choosing each other despite fear, despite loss, despite every reason the world had given them to stay isolated and safe. But sometimes the best love stories aren't about perfection. They're about people who are brave enough to try anyway. The weeks that followed their conversation in the study transformed the ranch in ways both subtle and profound. Rowan didn't suddenly become soft or openly affectionate. That would have been contrary to his nature. But the walls he'd built around himself began developing doors, small openings that let Ella and Jonah slip through into spaces that had been locked for years. He started taking breakfast with them in the kitchen instead of eating alone in his study. Began carrying Jonah around the property in a sling Martha fashioned, pointing out horses and explaining ranch operations to a baby who gurgled and grabbed at his shirt buttons. Once, Ella found him sitting on the porch with Jonah asleep against his chest. One large hand curved protectively around the small body, and the expression on Rowan's face was so tender it made her eyes sting. But trust, once broken by loss, doesn't heal overnight. Rowan still checked on Jonah compulsively, still tensed whenever Ella left his sight for too long, still woke from nightmares he refused to discuss. The fear of losing them hadn't disappeared. It had just learned to coexist with hope. November brought the first serious snow, transforming the ranch into something otherworldly. Ella stood at her bedroom window one morning, watching white fall from gray skies, and realized with a start that she'd been at Carter Ranch for nearly 3 months. 3 months since the fire had destroyed everything she'd known. 3 months since a stranger on a black horse had pulled her from certain death. Except Rowan wasn't a stranger anymore. He was the man who carved toys for her son, who taught her to shoot and insisted she carry a weapon even though Mortenson's threats had faded to nothing, who looked at her across the dinner table with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. The man she was falling in love with, if she was honest with herself. The realization should have terrified her. Thomas had been dead less than a year, and here she was developing feelings for another man. But Thomas had been broken long before he died, had stopped being a husband in any meaningful sense months before he pulled that trigger. Grief for what he'd been competed with relief that she'd survived what he'd become. And Rowan was nothing like Thomas. Where her husband had been weak and bitter, Rowan was strong and steadfast. Where Thomas had blamed the world for his failures, Rowan took responsibility for everything, sometimes too much responsibility, carrying guilt that wasn't his to bear. "You're thinking too loud." Ella startled, turning to find Martha in the doorway with an armful of clean linens. The older woman's knowing smile suggested she'd read every thought on Ella's face. "Just watching the snow," Ella said too quickly. "Mm-hmm. And I'm just delivering sheets." Martha set the linens on the bed. "You know, the boss has been different since you came. Lighter. Like he's remembering what it feels like to be alive instead of just surviving." "Martha, I'm not prying. Well, maybe a little." Martha's expression softened. "But I've known that man for 20 years. Watched him build this empire. Watched him fall in love. Watched him break when he lost everything. And I've watched him these past 3 months with you and that baby. And I see something I haven't seen in 6 years." "What's that?" "Hope." Martha moved to the window, standing beside Ella to watch the snowfall. "He's hoping again. Letting himself imagine a future that isn't just duty and loneliness. That's because of you." "I'm not sure that's fair to him," Ella said quietly, "putting that kind of expectation on what we are." "And what are you?" The question hung in the air. Ella didn't have an answer. They weren't courting, not formally. But they weren't just friends either. They existed in some undefined space between gratitude and affection, between protection and partnership. "I don't know," Ella admitted. "But whatever it is, it matters." "Then maybe it's time to define it." Martha's hand squeezed Ella's shoulder. "Before winter sets in and makes everything harder. Before the isolation and the cold give fear a chance to grow again." That evening, after Jonah was asleep and the ranch had settled into quiet, Ella found herself standing outside Rowan's study door. She'd been there dozens of times before, but this felt different, weighted with possibility and risk. She knocked. His voice called permission to enter. And when she stepped inside, she found him exactly where she'd expected, at his desk, surrounded by ledgers and papers, the lamp casting harsh shadows across his severe features. "Ella." He set down his pen immediately, giving her his full attention. "Everything all right?" "I need to talk to you about something." She closed the door behind her, suddenly nervous. "About us." Rowan's expression became carefully neutral. "All right. We never discussed what happens next, after winter, after—" She gestured helplessly. "After we figure out what this is. What do you want to happen?" His voice was steady, but she could see tension in his shoulders. Ella moved closer, perching on the edge of his desk so she could see his face clearly. "I want Jonah to grow up here. I want him to learn to ride from old Pete and bother the ranch hands for stories. I want him to run wild in these fields and learn what it means to build something with your own hands." "He can have that," Rowan said immediately. "I already told you. This is your home for as long as you want it." "But what about me?" The question emerged softer than she'd intended. "What do you want for me, Rowan?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him wrestle with words that clearly didn't come easy. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I want you to be happy, safe. I want you to have choices instead of just survival. I want—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I want you to stay, not because you need to, but because you want to. Because being here with me is better than being anywhere else." "It is better," Ella said simply. "That's what I'm trying to tell you." Something flickered in Rowan's eyes, surprise maybe, or cautious hope. "Even though I'm difficult? Even though I'm still learning how to be around people without pushing them away?" "Even though." She reached out, her hand covering his on the desk. "But I need to know what we're building toward. Are we just coexisting? Or is this something more?" Rowan turned his hand over, threading their fingers together. "I'm not good with words, not the pretty ones anyway. But I can show you." He stood, pulling her gently to her feet, and walked to a cabinet in the corner of his study. From inside, he retrieved a wooden box, different from the one that held Emily's things, newer and less worn. "I've been working on this," he said, setting the box on the desk and opening it carefully, "since about 2 weeks after you arrived. Wasn't sure I'd ever show you, but—" He trailed off, gesturing for her to look. Inside the box were documents, legal papers, meticulously organized and annotated in Rowan's precise handwriting. Ella picked up the first one, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized what she was seeing: a deed. To her property, the burned cabin, the 40 acres, the water rights. But this deed listed her as sole owner, with all the legal language necessary to ensure no one could contest it. Beneath that was another document, a trust fund established in Jonah's name, funded with enough money to ensure his education and future regardless of what happened. And beneath that, most surprising of all, was a contract transferring ownership of 50 acres of prime Carter ranch land into Ella's name. No conditions, no stipulations, just legal title to property worth more money than she'd see in 3 lifetimes. "Rowan, I can't," her voice caught. "This is too much." "It's not enough." He moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Your land gives you independence. The trust gives Jonah security. And the ranch land," he paused, "that gives you power. Real power. Not just the kind that comes from being under someone's protection. If you own part of Carter Ranch, you're not a guest here. You're a partner." "Why?" Ella set the papers down carefully. "Why would you do this?" "Because I need you to know you have choices." Rowan turned to face her fully. "If you stay here, if we try to build something together, I need you to do it freely. Not because you're trapped or dependent or grateful, but because it's what you actually want. And if I want to leave, if I take all this and walk away—" Pain flickered across his face, but his voice stayed steady. "Then you leave. And I'll know that at least I gave you the means to choose your own life." Ella studied him. This man who was giving her everything while asking for nothing in return, who was so terrified of trapping her that he'd rather lose her than see her stay out of obligation. The gesture was so fundamentally Rowan, so perfectly aligned with who he was beneath all the hardness and fear. "You're an idiot," she said softly. Rowan blinked. "What?" "A beautiful, noble, self-sacrificing idiot." She moved closer, close enough to feel his warmth. "You think giving me the means to leave will somehow protect your heart when I stay? You think I don't see what you're really doing here? And what am I doing? Showing me that you love me without having to say the words out loud." Ella's hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart hammer beneath her palm. "Because you're scared that if you say it, if you make it real, fate will take it away again." Rowan's jaw tightened. "Maybe I am. Then I'll say it first." Ella took a breath, diving into the deep end without knowing if he'd follow. "I love you, Rowan Carter. Not because you saved my life or gave me shelter or fought my battles, but because you're good and broken and trying so damn hard to be better. Because you hold my son like he's made of light, Because you carved a horse in the dark and thought I wouldn't understand what that meant. Ella, I love you, she repeated, needing him to hear it, to believe it. And I'm staying, not because of deeds or money or security, but because being with you feels like home in a way nothing else ever has. Because when you're gone, the world feels less solid. Because you make me want to be brave enough to try again. Rowan stood frozen, his expression raw and overwhelmed. Then slowly, his hands came up to frame her face with devastating gentleness. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Probably not, but you're getting me anyway. Ella smiled through the tears blurring her vision. So you might as well get used to it. And finally, Rowan Carter let himself do what he'd been wanting to since the moment she'd walked into his study weeks ago. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was the kiss of a man who'd been starving and had just been offered sustenance, desperate and claiming and full of emotions he still couldn't name. Ella responded in kind, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer while he held her like she might disappear if his grip loosened. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. I love you too, he said, the words rough and unpracticed but absolutely sincere. I've loved you since I pulled you from that fire, and you looked at me like I was salvation instead of just another hard man. I didn't know how to let myself feel it. And now? Now I'm terrified and hopeful and alive, and it's all your fault. His thumb traced her lower lip. Stay with me. Not as a guest, not as someone I'm protecting. Stay with me as my partner, my wife, if you'll have me. The proposal was characteristically graceless, delivered with all the romance of a business negotiation. But Ella heard what he wasn't saying, the plea beneath the words, the vulnerability of a man who'd sworn never to risk his heart again offering it up anyway. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Rowan's relief was palpable. He kissed her again, softer this time, almost reverent. And when he pulled back, there was something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Joy, pure and uncomplicated. We should probably tell people, Ella said, suddenly aware they were standing in his study, kissing like teenagers. Probably. Though Martha's probably already planning the wedding. He was right. When they emerged from the study hand in hand, they found Martha sitting at the kitchen table with a knowing smile and a pot of tea. About time, the older woman said simply. I'll start making lists in the morning. The wedding happened 6 weeks later, delayed only by the practical considerations of winter weather and legal paperwork. Catherine Wells handled the documentation with professional efficiency, ensuring that Ella's legal status was ironclad before the ceremony. The deeds were filed, the trust established, and every possible protection put in place. But the wedding itself was nothing like the formal affair Ella had endured with Thomas. This was a ranch wedding, held in the barn because the chapel in Redemption Creek seemed too small, too constraining for what they were celebrating. Old Pete strung lanterns from the rafters while young Tommy and the other hands arranged hay bales for seating. Martha cooked for 3 days straight, producing mountains of food that would feed everyone on the ranch and half the territory besides. The morning of the ceremony, Ella stood in her borrowed bedroom, soon to be their bedroom, wearing a simple dress Martha had altered from her own wedding gown. It was pale blue instead of white, practical but beautiful, with delicate embroidery at the cuffs that must have taken hours. You look beautiful, Martha said, pinning Ella's hair up with gentle efficiency. The boss is going to forget how to breathe when he sees you. I'm nervous, Ella admitted, watching her reflection. What if this doesn't work? What if we're moving too fast? You survived a fire together. You fought off claim jumpers. You've already seen each other at your worst and decided to stay anyway. Martha set down the pins and turned Ella to face her. That's more foundation than most marriages start with. The rest is just choosing each other every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sam poked his head in, looking uncomfortable in his formal clothes. Mrs. Hartley, the boss sent me to... Well, he wanted me to ask if you... Sam trailed off, clearly embarrassed. He wants to make sure you're still willing, that you haven't changed your mind. Ella's heart squeezed. Of course Rowan would send someone to check. Of course his fear would manifest as giving her one last exit, one final chance to run. Tell him, she said clearly, that if he's not at that altar in 10 minutes, I'm coming to drag him there myself. Sam grinned and disappeared. Martha chuckled while pinning a simple wreath of winter greens in Ella's hair. That man is going to spend the rest of his life waiting for you to realize you could do better. Your job is to keep proving him wrong. The walk to the barn felt surreal. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Ranch hands lined the path, tipping their hats as Ella passed with Jonah bundled against her chest in the sling. Martha had argued that babies didn't belong at ceremonies, but Ella had refused to be separated from her son. He was part of this, part of the family they were building. The barn doors opened to reveal a space transformed. Lantern light glowed golden, warming the cold air. Hay bales were arranged in rows filled with ranch hands and their families, plus the scattered neighbors who'd made the journey despite the snow. And at the front, standing with the circuit preacher who visited quarterly, was Rowan. He wore dark clothes, formal by ranch standards, and his hair was slicked back in a way that suggested Martha had terrorized him into submission. But his eyes, God, his eyes when they found her, held everything he still struggled to say out loud. Love and fear and fierce determination all tangled together. Ella walked down the makeshift aisle with her head high, aware that everyone was watching but only caring about the man waiting for her. When she reached him, Rowan's hand came up to touch Jonah's head gently before taking her hand. "You came," he said quietly, for her ears only. "Did you really think I wouldn't? Part of me has been waiting for you to realize what a bad bet I am. Then that part of you is about to be disappointed." Ella squeezed his hand. "I'm here, Rowan. I'm staying. Get used to it." The preacher cleared his throat, clearly amused by their whispered conversation. "Shall we begin?" The ceremony was brief and practical, befitting a frontier wedding. No lengthy sermons about obedience or submission, just simple vows about partnership and commitment, about choosing each other through whatever came next. When the preacher asked if Rowan would take Ella as his wife, his "I do" was so fierce it carried to the rafters. And when he asked Ella the same question, she answered clearly, "I will, absolutely and without reservation." The kiss that sealed their marriage was appropriate for public consumption, brief and chaste, and nothing like the desperate kisses they'd shared in private. But the promise behind it was clear. This was a beginning, not an ending, the start of something they'd build together, day by difficult day. The celebration that followed was joyous and chaotic. The barn filled with music from a fiddle player old Pete had rustled up from somewhere. Food appeared on long tables. Martha's roast beef and fresh bread, pies and cakes contributed by neighboring ranches, and enough whiskey to warm everyone against the cold. Ranch hands danced with neighbors' daughters, while Rowan and Ella were toasted and teased in equal measure. Through it all, Jonah watched everything with wide eyes, eventually falling asleep against Rowan's chest while the celebration continued around them. And Ella, watching her new husband hold her son with such casual tenderness, felt something settle deep in her chest. This was right. This family they were building from ash and hope, this was worth every risk. When the dancing finally wound down and the last guest departed into the winter night, Rowan carried Jonah upstairs while Ella followed. Together they settled the baby in the cradle that had been moved into the master bedroom. Their bedroom now, though it would take time to think of it that way. "He's getting big," Rowan said softly, tucking the carved horse beside Jonah's sleeping form. "Won't be long before he's walking, and then we'll never rest again." Ella moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "Are you ready for that? For all of it? The noise and chaos and complete lack of privacy that comes with raising a child?" "Probably not." Rowan's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. "But I'm willing to try, and I've got you to help me figure it out." They stood there for a moment, watching Jonah sleep, both aware that their wedding night was waiting, but neither quite ready to leave this peaceful scene. "I want more," Ella said suddenly. "More children, I mean. If we can. I want this house filled with noise and life and all the things you've been missing." Rowan tensed slightly. "After what happened to Emily, I know, and I know that scares you." She turned in his arms to face him. "But we can't let fear make all our decisions. We can get better doctors, take precautions, or we can adopt. There are always children who need homes. But I'm not going to let Emily's tragedy define our future. You're asking me to risk losing you. I'm asking you to trust that we're strong enough to survive whatever comes. Her hands framed his face. I'm not fragile, Rowan. I'm not going to break. And I'm not going to leave you alone in this life. He studied her face in the lamplight, and she could see him wrestling with old fears and new possibilities. Finally, slowly, he nodded. All right, but we do this smart. Good doctors, proper care, and if anything seems wrong, we'll be careful, Ella promised. Both of us. Together. The winter that followed their wedding was harsh but beautiful. Snow piled high enough to bury the fences, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the troughs. But inside the ranch house, warmth flourished. Rowan taught Ella to manage the ranch books, showing her the intricate balance of costs and profits that kept the empire running. She taught him to laugh again, to find joy in small moments, Jonah's first steps, a perfectly risen loaf of bread, the way the sunrise painted the snow pink. Spring arrived slowly, grudgingly, melting the snow inch by stubborn inch. And with spring came the task of rebuilding Ella's old property. The burned cabin was razed completely, the ash cleared away. In its place, they built something new, a small house, sturdy and weatherproof, with glass windows and a real floor and all the things Thomas had promised but never delivered. What will you do with it? Rowan asked one afternoon, standing beside her to survey the finished structure. Rent it, maybe, or let one of your married hands use it. Ella leaned against him, comfortable with casual contact now, in a way she hadn't been at the beginning. It's mine, but I don't need to live in it. I have a home already. Good. His arm came around her shoulders. Because I'm not letting you go anywhere. Still afraid I'll disappear? Every damn day. He said it like an admission, like something he was learning to live with. But I'm getting better at believing you when you say you're staying. By summer, the ranch had taken on a new character. Ella's influence was visible everywhere. In the garden she'd planted behind the house, in the mended curtains and fresh paint, in the way the bunkhouse now had actual beds instead of just hay and blankets. She'd earned the respect of the ranch hands through competence rather than position, proving she could doctor a sick horse and balance ledgers with equal skill. And Jonah thrived, growing into a sturdy toddler who followed old Pete around like a devoted shadow and had absolutely no fear of horses despite being smaller than their legs. He called Rowan Da in a baby babble way that made the hardened rancher's eyes suspiciously bright, and he owned every inch of Carter Ranch with the confidence of a child who'd never known anything but love. The letter arrived in August, carried by a traveling circuit rider who'd picked it up in Cheyenne. It was addressed to Rowan but marked urgent, and the seal was official, territorial government business. Ella found him in the study, the letter open on his desk, his expression unreadable. What is it? She moved closer, concerned by his stillness. Clay Mortensen is dead. The words hit like a physical blow. What? How? Kicked by his own horse, apparently. Died 3 days ago. Rowan set the letter down carefully. The territorial office is informing me because they found documents in his office. Plans for another attack on this ranch. Contracts with hired guns. Evidence of bribery and intimidation going back years. They're investigating? They already did. Mortensen had made enough enemies that when evidence of his crimes surfaced, people lined up to testify against his estate. Rowan's smile was grim. He's been stealing water rights, intimidating homesteaders, bribing officials, everything we suspected, and more. Does this change anything for us? It means the fight's over. Really over. No more threats, no more watching the horizon for trouble. He pulled her into his arms, and she felt the tension drain from his body. We're safe, Ella. You and Jonah and everything we've built. It's all safe now. That night, they sat on the porch as they had so many times before, watching the sun set over land that stretched farther than the eye could see. Jonah dozed between them, his small hand clutched around Rowan's finger. Tell me something, Ella said into the comfortable silence. That night in the fire, when you rode in to save us, what made you come that direction? You couldn't have known we were there. Rowan was quiet for a moment, considering. I was riding the perimeter, checking for spot fires. And I heard it, thought it was an animal at first, caught in the flames, But something made me push through anyway, even when it seemed impossible. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the last of the daylight. Maybe it was fate, maybe just luck, but I'm glad I listened to whatever voice told me to keep going. So am I. Ella leaned her head against his shoulder. Because I was ready to give up. Had already given up, really. I was just waiting for the end. What changed? You. The sound of your horse, the realization that maybe I hadn't been forgotten, after all. She smiled against his shirt. Turns out Salvation looks like a grumpy cowboy with terrible communication skills and a hero complex. I'm not a hero. You are to me, to us. She gestured to Jonah. You gave us a future when we had nothing. That's what heroes do. Rowan shifted uncomfortably with the praise, as he always did, but didn't argue. They sat in silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. I'm building something new, Rowan said suddenly. Been working on the plans for weeks. Want to show you. He retrieved a roll of paper from inside and spreading it on the porch floor where the lamplight could reach. Ella leaned forward, studying the carefully drawn blueprints. It's a sanctuary, Rowan explained, his finger tracing the various structures. For horses that have been abused or abandoned. And for people too, women mostly, who need a place to heal and learn skills. Blacksmithing, leatherwork, ranch management, things that can help them support themselves. Ella stared at the plans, understanding dawning. You want to help people like me, people who've lost everything. I want to make sure no one has to face what you faced alone. His voice was rough. We've got the land, the resources. Martha's already said she'd help run it, and I thought maybe you'd want to be involved too. You know what it's like coming back from nothing. Rowan, Ella's throat was tight. This is beautiful. Of course I want to help. We'd call it Ember Creek because sometimes fire destroys, but sometimes it clears the way for new growth. He looked almost shy, which was absurd on a man who commanded a ranch empire. Unless you think it's a terrible name. I think it's perfect. Ella took his hand, threading their fingers together. I think you're perfect. Difficult and closed off and absolutely perfect. I'm not. You are. To me and Jonah, you're everything. She kissed him softly, a promise and a benediction. And I can't wait to build this with you. All of it. The sanctuary, the family, the life we're making. Over the following months, they threw themselves into the project. A new barn went up on the eastern section of Carter Ranch, built specifically to house rescue horses. Corrals were constructed, a bunkhouse for the women who'd need temporary shelter, a workshop for learning trades. The territorial government, eager to atone for years of ignoring Mortenson's crimes, provided funding and official sanction. By Christmas, Ember Creek was operational. The first residents arrived in early January. A widow named Sarah with 3 children, fleeing an abusive son-in-law who'd tried to claim her property. Then a young girl, barely 17, pregnant and alone after her family had cast her out. Then more. A steady trickle of wounded people and wounded horses, all finding sanctuary on land that had once been defined by loneliness. Ella worked alongside them, teaching what she'd learned about survival and resilience. She showed Sarah how to manage accounts, helped the young mother, Caroline, prepare for childbirth with far better medical care than Ella had received. She gentled traumatized horses and traumatized women with equal patience, understanding that healing took time and trust in equal measure. And Rowan, to everyone's surprise, became the heart of the operation. He taught carpentry and metalwork, his patience with the broken matching, his patience with Ella. He carved toys for the children who arrived scared and silent, giving them something beautiful to hold on to. And when one of the horses, a mare who'd been beaten nearly to death by her previous owner, finally allowed him to touch her after weeks of careful approach, Ella saw him wipe his eyes and pretend it was dust. You're good at this, she told him that night, after the house had settled and they were alone in their bedroom. At what? At caring. At showing people they matter. She moved into his arms, fitting against him with the ease of long practice. You were always good at it. You just convinced yourself you weren't. I had good teachers. His hand came up to rest on her stomach, still flat, but not for much longer. Speaking of which, we should probably tell people soon. Ella smiled against his chest. They'd confirmed the pregnancy 2 weeks ago, and she'd been waiting for the right moment to share the news. Are you ready for them to know? Ready for all the fussing and worry? No, but I'm ready for this. For expanding our family, for... He paused, searching for words. For believing that good things can happen without disaster following them. Good things do happen. We're proof of that. She pulled back to look at him. We came from fire and loss and ended up here, building something beautiful, creating a place where people who've been broken can learn to be whole again. Like we did. Like we did, she agreed. They announced the pregnancy at dinner the next night, gathered around the long table with Martha, Sam, Old Pete, and several of the Ember Creek residents who'd become family. The room erupted in celebration, Martha immediately beginning to plan for the baby's arrival, the women offering advice and congratulations, the men looking pleased and slightly terrified in the way men do when confronted with the mysteries of childbirth. Jonah, now old enough to grasp that something important was happening even if he didn't understand what, banged his spoon against his plate and shouted, "Baby!" with such enthusiasm that everyone laughed. "That's right, little man," Rowan said, lifting Jonah onto his lap. "You're going to be a big brother. Think you can handle it?" Jonah considered this seriously, then nodded. "Baby," he repeated, satisfied with this arrangement. The pregnancy was easier than Ella's first, possibly because she wasn't alone this time. Rowan fretted constantly, bringing Dr. Morrison out from Cheyenne twice a month to check on her despite the expense. Martha fed her enough for 3 people, and the women of Ember Creek adopted her pregnancy as a communal project, knitting clothes and offering remedies and swapping birth stories that were by turns reassuring and terrifying. But through it all, Rowan was there, holding her when the morning sickness was bad, rubbing her aching back as her belly swelled, talking to the baby through her skin in a low voice that made her heart break with tenderness. The fear was still present. She could see it in his eyes whenever Dr. Morrison examined her, in the way he tensed at every wince or complaint. But he was learning to live with the fear instead of being controlled by it. The baby came in early May, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made Jonah hide under the kitchen table. Labor was hard and frightening, and nothing like the stories made it sound. But Ella had Dr. Morrison and Martha and Caroline, who'd stayed on at Ember Creek after her own baby's birth and become Ella's closest friend. And she had Rowan, holding her hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement when she was sure she couldn't continue. "You can do this," he said, his voice steady even though his hand trembled in hers. "You're the strongest person I know. Just a little more." And then, with a final push that felt like it might split her in two, their daughter was born. She came into the world wailing, red-faced and furious, absolutely perfect in every way. "A girl," Dr. Morrison announced, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket. "Healthy lungs, that's for certain." Rowan stared at the small bundle like he'd never seen a baby before, his face cycling through emotions faster than Ella could track. Joy and terror and wonder and love all fighting for dominance. "Would you like to hold her?" Martha asked gently. He nodded mutely, taking the baby with shaking hands. And Ella, exhausted and overwhelmed, watched her husband meet his daughter for the first time, watched him touch her tiny fingers, count her toes, examine every inch of her like he was memorizing her for future reference. "She's real," he whispered, awe in his voice. "She's really here." "What should we name her?" Ella asked, knowing they'd discussed options but never settled on one. Rowan looked at her, then back at the baby, then at the window where lightning flashed across the darkened sky. "Grace," he said finally, "because that's what this is. Grace we don't deserve but received anyway." So Grace Carter entered the world during a thunderstorm, immediately beloved by a mother who'd survived fire, a father who'd survived loss, and a brother who took one look at her and announced, "My baby," with such possessive certainty that everyone laughed. The months that followed were chaotic and exhausting and absolutely perfect. Grace proved to be a demanding infant, nursing constantly and sleeping in short bursts that left both parents bleary-eyed. Jonah oscillated between being a devoted big brother and being deeply offended that Grace couldn't immediately play with him. And Rowan discovered that having a daughter turned him into an even more impossible combination of protective and soft. "She smiled at me," he announced one evening, holding Grace like she was made of spun glass. "A real smile, not gas." "She's 3 weeks old," Ella said, amused. That was definitely gas. It was a smile. Rowan was adamant. She knows her father. Ella let him have the delusion. She was too busy fighting her own overwhelming love for this man who'd transformed from isolated rancher to devoted father, who wore spit up on his shoulder without complaint and could soothe a crying baby while simultaneously teaching Jonah his letters. By Grace's first birthday, Ember Creek had become a true community. 12 women and their children lived in the bunkhouse, learning trades and building futures. The horse sanctuary housed over 20 rescued animals, including the black stallion Rowan had ridden through fire, retired now to live out his days in peace. And the Carter family had become something more than just Rowan, Ella, and their children. It had expanded to include Martha and Sam, old Pete and young Tommy, Caroline and her son, and every person who'd found refuge on their land. They celebrated Grace's birthday with a party that filled the barn with laughter and music. Jonah, now a confident 4-year-old, ran wild with the other children. Grace tottered on unsteady legs, determined to walk even though she'd only mastered the skill a week ago. And Rowan and Ella stood together, watching their extended families celebrate, amazed at how far they'd come. "Do you ever think about that night?" Ella asked quietly. "The fire? Every day." Rowan's arm came around her waist. "But not with fear anymore, just gratitude, I guess. That I heard you, that I rode in, that you survived. We both survived." She leaned into him and built something beautiful from the ashes. "We're not done building yet." He smiled down at her. "Martha told me this morning that 3 more women are coming next week, and old Pete wants to expand the horse operation, maybe start breeding Mustangs for sale. So we'll build more." Ella turned in his arms to face him properly. "We'll keep building until we run out of land or energy or both. Because this," she gestured at the celebration around them, "this matters. Showing people that endings can become beginnings, that fire doesn't always mean destruction." "Sometimes fire leads you home," Rowan said softly, echoing words she'd spoken to him years ago. "Sometimes it does." Ella rose on her toes to kiss him, not caring who saw. "And sometimes home leads you to exactly who you were meant to be." The years continued to roll forward, bringing changes and challenges in equal measure. Jonah grew into a serious boy who loved horses and reading in equal measure. Grace proved to be fearless and stubborn, climbing things she shouldn't and arguing with anyone who told her she couldn't. A third child arrived, a son they named Thomas, in honor of Ella's first husband and as a reminder that even failed dreams deserve recognition. Ember Creek flourished, becoming known throughout the territory as a place of second chances. Women arrived broken and left strong, equipped with skills and confidence. Horses arrived scarred and left gentle, ready for new families. And Carter Ranch remained the foundation for it all, prosperous and productive and full of life. Through it all, Rowan and Ella built their partnership day by difficult day, learning each other's rhythms and patterns. They fought sometimes, about money, about parenting, about the balance between ranch business and Ember Creek, but they always came back to each other. Always chose each other, even when it was hard. On their 10th anniversary, Rowan surprised Ella with a gift. Not jewelry or flowers, but something far more precious, a bound journal, its pages filled with entries in his careful handwriting. "What is this?" she asked, turning the pages carefully. "Our story. Started writing it about 5 years ago, when I realized I wanted the children to know where they came from. How we began." He looked almost embarrassed. "Thought maybe someday they'd want to know that their parents weren't perfect, that we were broken people who found each other and decided that was enough to build on." Ella read the first entry, dated from the night of the fire, and her throat grew tight. He'd captured everything, the fear, the desperate ride through flames, the moment he'd seen her collapsed beneath that tree with Jonah clutched to her chest. "You rode into hell for us," she said, echoing the journal's words. "Best decision I ever made." Rowan pulled her close. "Because it led me to this, to you and the children, to Ember Creek, to a life I never imagined I deserved." "You deserve it all." Ella pressed a kiss to his jaw. "Every bit of happiness, every moment of peace. You earned it." "We earned it," he corrected, "together." And that was the truth they'd built their life on. Not that one person saved another, but that they'd saved each other. That love wasn't about grand gestures, but about choosing partnership every single day. That family was something you built with intention and patience and stubborn hope. The sun set over Carter Ranch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, horses grazed peacefully in the Ember Creek corrals. Closer, children's laughter drifted from the house where Martha was undoubtedly trying to wrangle them into bed. And on the porch, Rowan and Ella stood together, watching their empire settle into evening. "No regrets?" Ella asked. "Not a single one." Rowan kissed her temple. "You?" "Only that I didn't meet you sooner." "Everything in its time. We met when we needed each other most." And that was true. Fire had brought them together, fire and fate, and the kind of courage it takes to ride into flames for a stranger. But love had kept them together, had transformed two broken people into a family, into a community, into something that would outlast them both. Some fires destroy everything they touch, reducing whole lives to ash and memory. But some fires, the rare ones, the precious ones, burn away only what doesn't serve, leaving behind something stronger, something tempered by heat and hardship into permanence. Ella and Rowan had been forged in fire and refined by love. And the life they built, full of laughter and struggle, children and horses, second chances and stubborn hope, would stand as testament to what could grow from ashes when two people refused to give up on each other. Their story didn't end with a sunset. It continued in the children who ran through the ranch, in the women who found strength at Ember Creek, in every horse that learned to trust again, in the quiet moments of partnership that defined their days. But if there was one perfect moment, one point where everything they'd survived and built and become came together, it was this. Standing on the porch of their home, surrounded by evidence of their choices, knowing that they'd found exactly where they belonged, not despite the fire, but because of it, not in spite of their brokenness, but through it. Together, they'd built home from nothing, and that home would endure.